They said the sea around Hrafnsvik sang differently at dusk. It was not merely the usual roar tide against cliff, nor the soft murmur of foam crawling over black sand. It was deeper, older, an ethereal sound that seemed to come not from above or below, but from within, a resonance that belonged to no single wave or current, but to the sea as a whole. It was as if the vast salt body were remembering something, an oath, perhaps, a promise carved into coral and whale bone, a promise it had not yet decided to keep. The people of Hrafnsvik had lived with that sound for generations. They grew up hearing it as naturally as they heard wind in pine or the crackle of their hearths. But sometimes, especially on evenings when the air was unnaturally still, that song carried a strange note, melancholy, searching, almost human. Those were the nights the old women barred their doors and muttered prayers into their mead, for they said the sea was patient, but never forgetful. The boy who listened to the ocean, Eiríkr, son of Jarl, listened to the sea as other children listened to bedtime tales. He had first been taken to Clawful, the great peak overlooking the bay, when he was 6 years old. His mother, Inga the Calm, had carried him up the narrow path of twilight. She told him that the sea was not something to be feared, but something to be understood, that its beauty was born from its indifference, that those who loved it had to learn to love what could not love them back. That night, they sat in silence, and the boy heard the ocean breathe. The sound entered him, threading itself into the warp of his being. He remembered it for the rest of his life. As he grew, he learned the sea's vocabulary, the syllables of foam, the pauses between waves, the slow patience of the tides. It became his teacher, his confessor, and his most ruthless judge. When others saw only danger, he saw meaning. When fishermen prayed for calm, he prayed for storms, for it was in the storm that he felt closest to truth. Sometimes, when the wind shifted just so, he would hear it whisper back to him, not in words, but in tone. Eiríkr, the name carried like a secret born on salt. He never told anyone about that whisper. Some things he knew were not meant for sharing. The sea wolf and his bloodline. The villagers of Hrafnsvik called him the sea wolf. It was not a name of affection. It was a statement of awe, respect, and a trace of fear. They called him that because he carried the same duality as the sea. Fierce and nurturing, faithful and destructive, calm until provoked. When storms gathered, most men ran inland. Eiríkr walked to the beach. When the waves clawed at the shore, he stood among them, smiling like one greeting kin. His laughter rose above the wind, not mocking, not defiant, but accepting. He and the sea understood each other. To him, the sea was kin, teacher, and mirror. Kin, because the blood of Hrólfr's line was brined with salt. His ancestors had carved their homes from cliffs that bent over the water, their survival tied in nets, oars, and the mercy of the tide. Teacher, because it had taught him patience, the waiting of the tide, the timing of the wind. It had taught him to yield, not break, to strike only when the current favored him. Mirror, because it showed him his nature, never still, always hungry for horizon, faithful to nothing but freedom itself. His father, Jarl Hrólfr, loved him but did not understand him. The Jarl was a man of land and stone. His power was measured in walls, fields, and warriors. He respected the sea, yes, but from a distance. Eiríkr lived within it. Their conflict was not spoken but constant, a low tide and high tide within the same house. The father wished for a ruler. The son was born a wanderer. The father built fortresses. The son listened to waves dismantle mountains grain by grain. The evening of a change. That evening began like countless others. The twilight of Hrafnsvik painted the sky in hues of copper and pale rose, a fragile fire burning across the cold northern expanse. The wind came down from the glaciers, threading through the pines, and the sea answered with slow, rhythmic sighs. Eiríkr stood alone upon his favorite rock, the whale's jaw, a crescent-shaped outcrop that reached like a broken tooth into the surf. The tide lapped at its base, and every wave struck it with a sound that was almost a heartbeat. He listened. The sea was speaking again. Its song tonight was clear, almost tender. It was a melody of memory, the lullaby of a world that remembered too much. He closed his eyes, feeling the air thicken with salt and the subtle pulse of something vast beneath him. The smell of kelp and stone filled his lungs. For a long moment, He felt at peace, his soul folded into the rhythm of the waves. Then the peace broke, not with sound, but with absence. A silence fell so sudden and absolute that even the gulls seemed to vanish from the air. The waves stilled, as though the sea were holding its breath. And in that silence, Eiríkr's instincts flared. His eyes snapped open. At the edge of the world, with a line of sea-met sky, a black speck had appeared. It moved with purpose, slow but deliberate, growing larger with every blink. The speck became a shape, then a triangle, then a sail, dark as ink, swallowing the dying light. It was not the soft-bellied sail of a merchant ship, nor the patchwork canvas of fisher's craft. It was sleek, taut, predatory. Its presence alone changed the texture of the air. The song changes. The moment Eiríkr saw the sail, the sea's voice changed. It was not a gradual shift. It was violent, total. The melody he had known all his life collapsed into a discordant tone, like the tearing of a string under too much tension. The deep hum of the ocean became a drumbeat, slow, heavy, and ominous. The sea, which had once spoken in whispers, now roared in syllables of warning. The foam hissed as if alive, retreating from the rocks like frightened animals. Eiríkr's breath caught. He could feel the vibration through his feet, the pulse of something vast and offended stirring beneath the waves. The sound struck him in the chest, not as noise, but as message. The sea that had raised him was now speaking against him, or rather, against what approached. He had never heard it angry before. The wind turned, sharp and metallic. It carried his name again, but not the affectionate whisper of old. This was different, urgent, demanding. Eiríkr. The sound snapped through the air, clear and cold as a command. The black sail. The ship came closer. The black sail was enormous, its fabric catching what little light remained and devouring it. Beneath it, a hull carved from dark oak cut through the water like a moving wound. It had the build of a gnar, but not a merchant's. It was too armored, too proud. Figures moved along its deck. Men with helmets glinting faintly, axes at their belts, laughter carried faintly on the wind. And at the prow, towering like a carved idol, stood a single man. Even at this distance, Eiríkr saw him clearly. The outline was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, a mane of fire-red hair bound in braids, and a posture that reeked of defiance. Jartan Silvertooth. The name came to Eiríkr's mind unbidden. Though he had never met the man, he knew it the way wolves know the scent of another predator. It was said that Jartan's laughter could unsettle priests, that he plundered churches and burial mounds alike, and that he sold relics of gods as trinkets to kings. He was a man who walked not under divine protection, but under divine challenge, a living affront to the sacred order. Where others feared blasphemy, he made it his trade. And now, that same man was sailing into Hrafnsvik, carried by a sea that did not want him, beneath a sky that had begun to look away. The night before his ship arrived, the dogs had howled until their throats cracked. The next morning, fishermen found the water near the shore filled with jellyfish, hundreds of them, pulsing faintly like fragments of moon. The air carried a smell that none could name, metallic, sharp, and old. The oldest women muttered that the sea was sweating. The younger ones prayed that it was only weather. By dusk, the air itself seemed strained, as though the world were holding its breath. The gulls wheeled inland, their cries sharp and brief. The fjord stretched outward, calm but too still, like glass waiting to shatter. Eiríkr stood upon the whale's jaw, the stone outcrop that jutted like a fong into the bay. He had climbed it since he was a boy, but tonight it felt foreign beneath his boots, its heartbeat absent, its usual rhythm disrupted. The sea below him had always sung to him. Now it hummed with a strange, hollow tone, a song out of tune. And then he saw it, a small black shape on the horizon, framed by the dying light of the sun. It moved steadily forward, neither fast nor hesitant, but with the confidence of something that already knew its destination. A ship with a black sail, drinking in all light, turning the golden water beneath it to bronze. As it approached, the sea began to change. The waves, which had been rolling gently moments before, turned sluggish, their motion uneven. Foam gathered near the rocks, thick and reluctant, as if the water itself wanted to draw back. The usual harmony of tide and current fractured into discord. The sea, which had always been his mirror, no longer looked like him. It looked like something watching him. He heard it then, the whisper between waves, the deep murmur that belonged to neither wind nor water. Something has come that should not have come. The arrival. By the time the ship reached the mouth of the fjord, the whole village had awakened. Smoke rose in spirals from the chimneys. Doors creaked open. The people of Hrafsvik, fishers, shepherds, smiths, women with nets in their hands, stood on the docks, shading their eyes. They saw the black sail Nar gliding toward them, and their hearts turned heavy. It was not a warship in design, but there was something of violence in its silence, in the deliberate, almost arrogant way it cut through the still water. It seemed to move without oars, as if pulled by an unseen hand beneath the surface. Eiríkr did not descend to join them. He stayed on his rock, higher than the village, so he could see what others could not, the pattern that the keel drew across the water. The wake did not spread evenly, but coiled, spiral after spiral, like a serpent twisting under the waves. His blood ran cold. The sea was not merely disturbed. It was reacting. As the Nar approached, its prow carved through the reflection of the setting sun, splitting it in two. The fjord swallowed the light. The ship glided into the harbor, slow and sure. When it stopped, the only sound was a faint slap of waves against its hull. From its deck came the sound of laughter, low at first, then rising, laughter that did not belong to joy but to possession. The villagers froze. Even the wind faltered. That laugh reached the cliffs and seemed to echo back, thinner but sharper, like the cry of a bird of prey. And on the deck, his red beard gleaming like fire against the dark, Jartan Silvertooth stood smiling, the mark of the profane. He stepped off the gangplank with the ease of a king entering his hall. He wore no helmet, no mail, just a thick bearskin cloak that dripped with salt, and on his belt a dagger shaped like a thong. His eyes were gray, storm-cold, and they took in everything. The faces of the villagers, the huts, the nets, the shrine of Thor at the hill's base, with the same casual disdain. He moved like a man who believed the world itself was his plunder. Behind him came his crew, lean men with hard eyes, carrying chests and bundles. They spoke little. The air around them carried the faint scent of iron and burnt incense. The dogs began barking again, then stopped abruptly when Jartan looked at them. One of the old men whispered, "He carries something that does not want to be carried." They were right. At the center of the ship's deck, half covered by a cloth of southern silk, rested an object that glowed faintly even in the failing light. A ring, large in red gold, its surface engraved with shapes that seemed to move when one looked too long. Some said they saw falcons in flight. Others swore the markings were tears. Eiríkr, from his perch above, felt the air tighten when Jartan's hand brushed the ring. The sea behind him gave a single, low moan, the sound of something deep being woken unwillingly, the whisper of the past. That night, when the ship was finally anchored at the stone docks, the village tried to pretend that life was as it had been. The smiths closed their forges. The women lit the lamps. The fishermen told their children that tomorrow would bring calm water again, but the air itself refused peace. The gulls that roost on the cliffs did not return. The waves came in regular beats, like a heart struggling between two rhythms. Even the firelight seemed uncertain, flickering, paling whenever the wind shifted toward the sea. Eiríkr remained by the water long after everyone else had gone. The moon rose slow and cold, turning the fjord into a mirror of silver and shadow. He crouched at the edge of the surf, watching the water swirl around his fingers. At first, he thought the movement was ordinary, just the tide pulling against his touch. But as he leaned closer, he saw symbols forming in the ripples, circular marks, lines within lines, like runes too old for any alphabet. They shimmered, then vanished before he could recognize them. He whispered to the sea, as he had done since childhood, "What is it you remember?" No sound came in reply, only a feeling, a pressure, like a hand gripping his chest. It wasn't pain, it was possession. The sea had always answered him before, but now, for the first time, it refused him. A single wave struck his knees, cold as iron, and in that shock of chill, he understood something terrible. The sea was no longer speaking to him. It was speaking around him, as if warning others that he was part of what was to come. The night of signs. All that night, strange things happened in Hrafsvik. The nets that hung outside to dry were found tangled in the morning, though there had been no wind. The ravens gathered in pairs upon the roofs, silent. The air smelled of rain, though no clouds came. And on the beach, children found dozens of fish wash ashore, each one with its eyes open wide, unblinking, as if they had seen something beneath the waves that men were not meant to see. The women whispered that it was a return, that something long promised, or long banished, was coming home. Eiríkr could not sleep. He went to the cliffs again at dawn. The tide had receded farther than he had ever seen, leaving the shore slick with seaweed and strange shells shaped like eyes. In the distance, Kjartan's ship sat motionless, its black sail furled but still heavy, like the wing of a dead bird. He could hear laughter faintly from the deck. It was the same laughter that had echoed the day before. It hadn't stopped. It had only gone quiet enough to hide beneath the wind. The awakening of the oath. That evening, the moon returned full and heavy, its light like bone upon the water. The fjord was so still that the reflection of the cliffs was perfect, an inverted world beneath the surface. But something stirred within that reflection, a tremor, a pulse, a slow ripple that did not belong to wind or current. The sea had remembered, far below the reach of light, deeper than whales could dive. Something vast shifted. It had no name anymore, no shape that language could define. It was memory made flesh, a covenant fossilized in darkness. The sea, ancient and patient, remembered its debt. It had been promised something, blood perhaps, or sorrow, or the return of what had been stolen. Now it sensed that promise awakening. The balance was tilting again. The world above was stirring the one below. Eiríkr felt it before he saw it. His bones ached. His breath came heavy, as though the air itself had thickened. The waves began to hum, a low sound that made the stones vibrate beneath his feet. He knelt, placing his hand on the cold water. "What do you want of me?" he whispered. The sea did not answer in words, but in rhythm. A single wave rolled forward, touched his boots, and retreated, leaving behind a pattern of foam that spelled one clear, terrible word. Soon, the foam dissolved, but the meaning remained. The message was not a threat. It was a schedule, the chosen and the damned. When he rose, he found himself smiling. But it was not the smile of joy. It was something older, colder, a recognition. He had felt this once before, years ago, during a storm that had nearly killed him. The same pulse, the same sense of being seen by something immense and ancient. He understood now. He was no longer merely a listener of the sea. He had become its instrument. The balance that had shifted was not abstract. It was personal. The sea, his lifelong companion, was calling upon him to restore what Kjartan had disturbed. It had chosen him because no one else could hear its language. He felt no fear, only inevitability. Some destinies were not to be sought. They were to be answered. He turned toward the village. The black-sailed ship loomed against the moonlight, motionless and arrogant. Its reflection quivered in the water, and for a heartbeat, Eiríkr thought he saw something looking back from beneath it. Two faint lights, green and vast, like eyes opening slowly in the deep. He blinked, and they were gone. But the impression lingered, the certainty that the ocean was awake, and that it had begun to watch. The sea speaks once more. The next morning, when dawn broke pale and colorless, Hrafsvik felt different. The world seemed to have tilted half a degree off its axis. The birds flew lower. The waves hit the shore in an unfamiliar pattern. 3 strikes, a pause, then one long pull outward. Eiríkr walked the beach alone. The sand was littered with strange, translucent shells. Each one was shaped like a tear. When he looked toward the horizon, he could no longer see where the sea ended and the sky began. It was all one living expanse, breathing in slow rhythm, waiting. He placed a hand over his heart. The rhythm matched. He smiled again, the faint, resigned smile of one who has stopped pretending there is a choice. The peace of Hrafsvik was gone. The sea had spoken, and its son had heard. The ship came slicing to the fjord like a black blade to the skin of a memory, cleaving the quiet waters of Hrafsvik in two. The sea did not roar beneath it. It recoiled. The wake it left shimmered faintly, as if unwilling to close again, as if the very water could sense the reverence it carried. It was not the long, lean warship of conquest, nor a fisherman's humble craft, but Nar, a heavy-bellied vessel, half merchant, half predator. Its hull was scarred by salt and battle, its ribs reinforced with foreign iron. Every plank looked soaked with history, as though it had been carved from timber that had already heard too many dying breaths. The ship moved with the deliberate slowness of something aware of its own gravity. It was not rushing toward port. It was entering, in the truest sense of the word, crossing thresholds, announcing itself, demanding acknowledgement from the land and sea alike. At its prow stood a figure impossible to ignore, Jarton Silvertooth. He was carved from the same material as the myths, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in wolfskins that reeked of salt and fire. His red beard was thick and plated with small bronze rings that caught the morning light like captured suns. The metallic gleam of his namesake, a silver inlay glinting in one of his canines, flashed whenever he grinned, which was often. He grinned not from joy, but from sport, the way men grin before setting fire to something precious. Jarton was not merely a raider or a traitor. He was a walking paradox, a destroyer of sanctity who treated sacrilege as art. His laughter, a booming, guttural sound that rose from his chest like smoke from a forge, was infamous up and down the coast. They said his laughter stripped souls bare, that it could drive a priest to tears, a widow to rage, and a brave man to silence, and that he had never once, in all his years, laughed out of kindness. He laughed at the things most men revered, gods, grief, love. He laughed at funerals and offerings alike. That morning, his laughter arrived before his ship even moored, the profane cargo. When the Nar came to rest at the docks of Rafsvik, the people gathered instinctively. Curiosity, after all, was its own curse. The villagers came down from the hills and the smithies, from the mead halls and the boats still drying from dawn's fishing. They expected trade or tribute, perhaps a display of wealth from the southern coasts. What they found was a desecration masquerading as commerce. The deck of Jarton's ship was a grotesque bazaar of plunder, not furs, fish, and timber like honest merchants, but the spoils of defiance. There were statues of pale marble, gods with broken faces, their eyes blind from the pickaxe. There were silks from southern temples, dyed in colors that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, gold idols, melted and recast into goblets, crosses hacked from monasteries, trinkets of faith stripped of meaning and turned to trophies. And above it all, the centerpiece rested upon a pedestal fashioned crudely from a broken shield, a ring, a massive band of red gold. Its color was darker than the gold of men's forges, closer to the hue of old blood or of sunlight seen through dying embers. The metal seemed to hum faintly, the way air trembles before a storm. Intricate carvings adorned its surface. Falcons mid-flight, wings curved in eternal pursuit, and between them, strange drops, shapes like tears or dew, or perhaps small falling souls. When Jarton lifted it into the morning light, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Even those who had never set foot in a temple could feel it. Something about the ring seemed alive and wrong. It wasn't cursed in the way ordinary men imagine curses. No skulls, no runes, no foul smoke, but in its silence, in the quiet insistence of its presence. It radiated dissonance. Jarton grinned wider. "You stare as if it might bite," he said, his voice rich and booming. "But it only remembers who touched it last." He held it up for all to see, turning it slowly between his thick fingers. "This," he said, "once belonged to a high priestess, or so the Southerners claimed. They said it was Freyja's token, the weeping jewel, a symbol of divine sorrow." He laughed, a deep, thunderous sound that rolled over the water like distant thunder. "Sorrow, eh? I found it buried beneath a DYSS, a grave mound older than the stones themselves. If their goddess wept for her loss, then her tears have long since turned to gold." He tossed the ring into the air and caught it again, the metal flashing in the pale light. "Now it belongs to no god." The villagers laughed, hesitant, nervous laughter, the kind that seeks protection through mimicry. They laughed because Jarton laughed, because to remain silent would be to acknowledge the wrongness of it, and none dare be first to name it. Even the Jarl's men chuckled dryly. though their hands fidgeted at their belts. Only one man did not laugh, the silent witness. At the edge of the crowd, apart from the laughter and the murmuring, Eiríkr Rolderson stood motionless. He was no stranger to blood or danger. The son of the Jarl, known already by many as Eiríkr the Sea Wolf, he had fought in storms that tore sails apart, hunted raiders through fog, and walked away from shipwrecks that claimed entire crews. But this moment chilled him in a way no blade ever had. It was not fear, it was recognition. He felt the air shift, heavy and metallic, as though the fjord itself were listening. The laughter around him grew faint. The ring gleamed faintly in Kjartan's hand, and the reflection of its red-gold light moved like flame across the faces of the villagers. Eirikr's eyes fixed not on the ring, but on Kjartan. There was something in the raider's expression, a glint of triumph too deliberate, too aware. The sea wolf felt something stir deep in his chest, something ancient as the tides, the instinct of balance. He stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice was calm, quiet, but it cut through the laughter like a blade through ice. Gold from a grave buys curses, not feasts. The words hung in the cold air, simple and absolute. It was not an insult, not even an accusation. It was a statement of truth, the kind that carried the weight of the unseen. The crowd fell silent. Even the sea seemed to draw a breath. Kjartan turned his head slowly toward him. For a moment, his grin faltered. The laughter died in his throat. He stared at Eiríkr, measuring him, not as a foe, but as a mirror. Then that grin returned, wider now, edged with amusement and danger. "Curses?" he said, his tone mock gentle. "Tell me, son of Rolder, have you ever seen a curse you couldn't bleed?" His men chuckled again, though their laughter lacked conviction. Eiríkr did not answer. He simply held Kjartan's gaze, unflinching. His silence was an answer in itself, an acknowledgement that the forces Kjartan mocked could not be parried with wit. Something in that silence unnerved the raider. Kjartan's eyes glimmered with something half-mad, half-thrilled. He spread his arms, turning in a slow circle to address the watching crowd. "Here stands the Jarl's son, the wise one. He tells us that the sea takes offense, that the gods keep ledgers." His voice rose, each word striking like a hammer. "Well then, let them come for me. Let them send their waves, their storms, their serpents. I will meet them all with laughter." He turned back to Eiríkr. "And if the gods are too cowardly," he said, grinning now with something feral behind his teeth, "then perhaps one of their wolves will do." He stepped down from the makeshift pillar, boots striking the planks with deliberate weight. The sound echoed. The tension that had been merely a hum in the air now became a vibration you could feel in the bones. Kjartan stopped a few paces from Eiríkr. "You speak of curses. Shall we see whose fate the gods favor?" Eirikr's hand hovered near his sword hilt, though he did not draw. His heartbeat was steady. He could smell salt and iron. "This is not the place," he said quietly, "nor the time." Kjartan's grin sharpened. "Then make it so." The challenge. The crowd felt it before either man moved, the inevitability. The sense that words had ended, that something larger than pride or anger now demanded expression. Kjartan spread his arms wide, exposing his chest. "You see this?" he roared, tapping the spot over his heart. "Strike, sea wolf. Curse me with your blade if you dare. Let the gods choose their servant." No one spoke. The sea wind died entirely, leaving only the soft groan of the ship's mooring ropes. The air itself had gone brittle, thin, waiting for something to break. Eiríkr said nothing. He simply nodded once. That gesture was enough. The villagers stepped back instinctively. The world contracted around the two men. Bjarni Quick Hands, the old skald who had seen too many such moments, exhaled slowly. "The Stone of Oaths," he murmured, his voice trembling. Kjartan's grin widened further. "Yes," he said, hearing him. "The Stone of Oaths. At dawn, let the fjord decide whose truth is heavier." He stepped back, lifting the red gold ring high for all to see. "When I win, I'll bury this under your father's hall," he said, laughing. "Let your people sleep on Freyja's tears." Eirikr's gaze never wavered. "And when I win," he replied softly, "the sea will take you back." Their eyes locked for a final, Electric moment. Then Jarton laughed again, louder this time, raw and genuine, the sound reverberating off the mountains. But beneath the laughter there was something else, the faint ring of fear disguised as joy. He turned and strode back to his ship, the red gold ring flashing in the dull light like a wound. The crowd parted silently as he went. When he was gone, the wind returned, sighing to the pine-covered cliffs, a sound that might have been a warning or perhaps a lament. Eiríkr stood alone on the dock, watching the ship recede into the dark mouth of the fjord. He felt the weight of the coming dawn settle on him, cold and inescapable. He knew what was to come. At the Stone of Odes, men spoke not with words, but with blood, the sea's witness. That night, the sea was unnaturally calm. The moon hung low, veiled by mist, casting the fjord in shades of steel and bone. The fishermen said the water smelled different, too clean, too sharp. Even the gulls had fled inland. In the Jarl's hall, Eiríkr sat in silence. His father, old Hrólfr, said little. The silence between them was a kind only warriors understood. His sister, Ursa, touched his shoulder once, saying softly, "He laughs at the gods. That never ends well." Eiríkr managed a faint smile. Then the gods will have their answer. Outside, the wind turned cold. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's bell tolled once, hollow and long. And out upon the water, beyond the reach of torches and eyes, something vast and ancient stirred beneath the waves, a slow, knowing motion like a heartbeat deep under the earth. The fjord remembered. The sea was listening. And in the darkness, far from shore, a faint, unfamiliar sound rose, something between a sigh and a laugh, carried on the wind, a god's warning, or perhaps, already, a curse beginning to breathe. At the next dawn, when the horizon still burned with a cold fire twilight, two men set foot on Steinje, the Stone of Odes, a barren, wind-scoured islet that jutted from the sea like the vertebra of some ancient leviathan. It was a place older than the Sagas, where men went not merely to fight, but to lay their truth before the gods. The island was small, no larger than a hall's length across, surrounded by black water and foam. No grass grew there, only lichen and stone slick with brine. The air tasted of iron. Here, law had no voice. Here, steel was language and blood was proof. At the first light, when the sun breached the eastern ridge, two figures stood upon that desolate altar. Jarton Silvertooth, raider and oathbreaker, his armor dark as rusted bronze, the grin still gleaming through his beard like a wolf's snarl. Eiríkr Hrólfrsson, son of a Jarl of Hrafsvik, known to some already as the Sea Wolf, though he had not yet earned the name in full. They faced each other inside the sacred square hides, 4 strips of tan leather pegged into the salt-crusted ground. The air within the square shimmered faintly with the presence of the unseen. The sea whispered all around them, restless, hissing between the rocks as though impatient for blood. The gulls screamed overhead, circling low. Even they seemed to understand that something of weight was about to occur, a moment that would ripple through both mortal and divine memory. Each man had 3 shields at his feet, as custom dictated. Each had chosen one silent witness to serve as guardian of the law. Theirs was Bjarni Quickhands, who stood a few paces away, his expression solemn, his eyes darting between them like a man reading runes written on air. The home gang was sacred. Once begun, it could not be stopped. Jarton spat onto the ground, grinning his feral grin. "One of us dies, the other lives as he pleases," he said. "Seems the gods favor me. I've already given them more laughter than they deserve." Eiríkr said nothing. He drew his sword in silence, the polished edge flashing once in the morning light. The weapon hummed faintly, a sound like breath drawn between teeth. His face was calm, almost serene, but his eyes, they were the color of the northern sea at dusk, deep and unreadable. Bjarni lifted his hand. "By the old law," he said, his voice low but firm, "let truth be decided by steel. Let the gods bear witness." He dropped his hand, and the fight began. Jarton struck first. He moved with terrifying speed for a man of his size, his great sword cutting a blazing arc through the cold air. The sound of it was like the tearing of silk, a cruel, metallic sunrise splitting the dawn. Eiríkr met the blow squarely. His shield buckled but held, though it's screaming under the force. Sparks left his blade met rim. The shock ran through his arm to his shoulder, numbing it. A second swing followed, faster, more vicious, and Eiríkr pivoted, letting it glance off the edge of his shield. The impact sent shivers through the hide square itself. The sea hissed louder, as if mocking the mortal drama unfolding above. Kjartan laughed, a full, unrestrained laugh, the sound of arrogance given form. His teeth, flecked with salt and blood, gleamed in the gray light. "You fight well, little wolf," he taunted. "But the sea doesn't favor pups, it favors beasts." He swung again, overhead, a killing blow. Eiríkr braced, but the force was too great. The sword came down like a judgment. His shield split from top to bottom, the crack echoing across the rocks like a thunderclap. Splinters flew, the iron rim twisting out of shape. The fragments fell to the stones at his feet, already slick with salt water. The crowd on the distant mainland shore, small figures watching in tense silence, stirred. Eiríkr threw the useless remnants aside. His breath came hard. He was down to his sword alone. The next exchange would decide the matter. Kjartan pressed forward, drunk on momentum and pride. He drove Eiríkr backward, step by step, the sea foaming at their heels. His blows rained down in relentless rhythm, hammering like the pulse of a storm. But Eiríkr was not the kind of man who met fury with fury. He was the sea's son, not of its waves, but of its current. He yielded, bent, flowed. He began to move differently, no longer merely defending, but listening. Every step Kjartan took, Eiríkr matched with the grace of a tide pulling back before a crash. His breathing steadied. The world narrowed to rhythm and motion. The hiss of the sea, the clash of steel, the sharp scent of blood beginning to rise. And then came the opening. Kjartan lifted his blade for another mighty downward strike, an attack so heavy it left his flank exposed. In that heartbeat of imbalance, Eiríkr lunged. He dropped low, twisted his wrist, and drove his sword upward. The steel found its mark with terrible precision, biting deep into Kjartan's thigh, slicing clean through flesh and artery. The sound was wet and final. Kjartan staggered, his sword slipping from his grip. His mouth opened, a gasp escaping that quickly became a strangled laugh. He sank to one knee, then the other, his massive frame trembling as his life poured out onto the stones. The blood came dark and fast, spreading through the cracks, turning the sea foam pink. Still he laughed. It was not mirth, it was madness, the laughter of a man who saw the end, and found it amusing. It echoed over the water, bright and terrible, like a hymn offered to the void. Eiríkr stood motionless, chest heaving. He felt no triumph, only the cold weight of inevitability. Kjartan's eyes lifted to him, their brightness fading. His voice came in ragged gasps, but his words were sharp as knives. "The gold stays," he hissed. Eiríkr frowned, stepping closer. "If you wear it," Kjartan said, his grin splitting again into something almost holy, "it will remember me." His hand twitched once, as if reaching for the invisible horizon, and then fell limp. Kjartan Silvertooth, the man who had defied gods and men alike, died smiling. For a long moment, nothing moved. The world seemed suspended between heartbeats. The wind stilled. The gulls ceased their cries. Even the waves seemed to hesitate. Then, slowly, the sea came forward. A single wave, low and deliberate, rolled across the stones, washing over Kjartan's body and the pool of blood beneath him. It was as though the ocean itself had reached out to claim its due. The water hissed, darkening with a mingled red, and withdrew again, dragging the first thin ribbons of blood back into its depths. The tide had received its offering. The witness, Bjarni Quickhands, stepped forward and raised his hand to the sky. "The home gang is ended," he declared, his voice hoarse. "The gods have seen and judged." His words barely reached Eiríkr. The sea wolf stood staring at the fallen man, the blood staining his boots, the salt spray stinging his face. His sword hung limp in his hand. There was no victory here, only the quiet, heavy knowledge that something vast had shifted, something far beyond men and law. He looked at the horizon, where the morning sun broke free from clouds. The light touched the sea and turned it to molten gold. In that reflection, the surface seemed to ripple, almost alive. Eiríkr felt it even then. The faint hum of something watching, listening, waiting. He sheathed his sword slowly, the blade whispering against the scabbard like a breath drawn through clenched teeth. The sound was thin, sharp, and final, a sound that seemed to seal something larger than a man's death. Behind him, the tide whispered over Kjartan's body once more, the foam curling around the fallen raider's limbs with almost deliberate patience. The water crept forward in increments, claiming inch after inch of flesh and leather, pulling him toward the edge where salt and stone met. Eiríkr did not look back. His breath came hard and even, misting in the morning air. The dueling ground, the stone of oaths, was silent now. No gulls cried. No wind stirred the grass. Even the sea, his lifelong companion, seemed hesitant to speak. The blood of the two men mingled on the stones, tracing faint, dark lines that shimmered when the light hit them, like veins in living rock. Eiríkr stared at them for a moment, struck by how they looked less like spilt life and more like runes. The water lapped at the markings and began to wash them away. By the time the next wave came, Kjartan's body was gone. No one saw it sink, but all who were present swore they heard something as it vanished, a faint, hollow laugh rising from beneath the waves. It rolled upward to the foam and air, echoing once, twice, before dissolving into the hush. It was not the laughter of mockery nor of madness. It was a laughter of recognition, as though the sea itself had remembered an old, cruel joke and found it newly relevant. It was brief but unmistakable, and that was how the legend began. The Stone of Oaths. Those who had come to witness the home gang did not cheer. There was no victory cry, no celebration of the Jarl's son's honor restored. They simply stood, unmoving, their eyes shifting from the empty stones to the horizon. The duel had ended, but something unseen had begun. The air was wrong, heavy metallic. The scent of salt had thickened until it stung the throat. The sea hissed softly, as though whispering to itself. Somewhere far down the shore, a seal barked once, then went silent. Old Bjarni, who had stood as witness of the gods, pressed his shaking hands together and whispered prayer to every name he could remember. Odin, Ran, Ægir, Christ, the nameless ones. His voice trembled. "The sea's taken its share," he muttered. "Let it be done. Let it stay beneath." But the others were not so certain. One by one, they turned their eyes to Eiríkr, the sea wolf, now the slayer of Kjartan Silvertooth, and saw in his face not triumph but unease. His expression was calm, but the kind of calm that follows revelation. His eyes, the gray of tempered steel, were fixed on the surf. He could not hear the laughter any more, but he felt it vibrating faintly beneath the soles of his boots, as if the ground itself had absorbed the sound and refused to let it go. The silence after victory. Eiríkr descended from the Stone of Oaths with the slow steps of a man walking through a dream. The world seemed quieter now, unnaturally quiet. The song of the waves had changed pitch. The usual high hiss of retreating water had deepened into something slower, more deliberate. Every breath of wind that touched him seemed to say the same thing. Remember, he stopped once at the edge of the beach, looking down at the black sand where Kjartan's blood had mixed with seawater. The foam there was tinged faintly pink. It gathered and broke, each wave smaller than the last, as if the sea were tasting what it had taken. He could not shake the feeling that something vast was now awake beneath those waves, something that had been content to dream until that morning. The duel was won, but the balance was broken. He had fulfilled the law of men, but the law of the sea was older, and it had its own reckoning. The return to the shore. When Eiríkr finally returned to the village, the people of Hrafsvik were already waiting for him. Word of the duel had traveled faster than the tide. The children who once adored him as their hero now watched in silence, eyes wide. The women crossed their wrists over their chests, warding off unseen things. Even his father, Jarl Hrolder, stood at the threshold of the longhouse with a face carved from grief and pride. "You did what honor demanded," the Jarl said, but his voice carried no warmth. His gaze lingered on his son's hands, still faintly red, though Eiríkr had washed them in the tide. "And yet," the old man murmured, almost himself, "I fear the sea keeps its own tally." Eiríkr said nothing. He walked past his father, past the fire, and out the other side of the hall, into the salt air again. He could not stay indoors that night. The walls felt too close. He made his way back to the shore and stood there until the stars appeared, not bright, but dim and cold, reflected faintly in the water. The horizon shimmered faintly, not with sunlight, but with a strange pallor, a ghostly gleam that flickered like light seen through deep water. At first, he thought it mirage. Then he saw it move. It was not light at all, but reflection, a soft, wavering glow shaped like a crown of seaweed and stars. He blinked. The vision dissolved into the horizon, but in its vanishing wake, he heard a whisper, so faint he could almost believe it was a wind. The gods have watched. The memory of the sea. That night, the sea did not rest. The waves rolled in slow and strange, whispering against the stones as though speaking a language only Eiríkr could half remember. He stood on the sand, sleepless, watching the tide pulse with an inner light, green and dim, like the eyes of something waiting far below. The gulls did not return to their cliffs. The air smelled faintly of rain and iron, though the sky was clear. And each time the surf reached his feet, he felt an ache in his chest. Not pain, but a deep vibration, as though his heart were answering a summons it did not understand. When he finally turned to leave, he glanced back once more at the Stone of Odes. The moon had risen high now, and its reflection on the wet stones looked like runes written in firelight. He could almost read them. One word burned clearer than the rest. Awakened. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since boyhood, he was afraid of the sea. The legend takes root. In the days that followed, the story spread across the coast faster than wind over the water. Fishermen claimed that when they cast their nets near the Stone of Odes, they heard laughter bubbling up from the depths, faint and distant, but too human to ignore. The Volva, the old seeress who lived in the hills above Hrafsvik, descended to the village for the first time in years. She spoke little, but when she saw Eiríkr, she bowed her head slightly, not in reverence, but in sorrow. "The sea has marked you," she said softly. "Its memory is old, and now it remembers through you." He did not ask what that meant. Some knowledge, he sensed, came with its own punishment. At night, the dreams began, dark and luminous at once. He saw the face of Kjartan Silvertooth beneath the waves, his silver tooth glinting faintly in the blackness. Around him, strands of seaweed drifted like a crown. His eyes were open, but they were no longer mocking. They were knowing. Each time Eiríkr woke, he found his skin damp with salt, though the longhouse was dry. The sea's memory. The villagers said that the sea around Hrafsvik began to change after the duel. The color of the water deepened, its calmness deceptive. Fish avoided the shallows. Boats rocked at anchor when there was no wind. On moonless nights, faint rings of phosphorescence appeared on the surface, circles of green fire, spinning slowly before fading away. No one dared to sail beyond the fjord. The Jarl, fearing what lay beneath the still waters, forbade all long voyages for the season. But Eiríkr knew it would not matter. The disturbance was not in the sea, it was in him. He began to hear the sea again, but the tone was new, no longer the patient teacher of his youth. It spoke in fragments, flashes of thought rather than melody. Oath, blood, return. Sometimes, when he placed his hand on the tide, he felt warmth beneath the surface, like a pulse. Other times, the water went cold as the grave. He understood then that the duel had not ended the story. It had only reopened it, the awakening. And so it was that the legend of that morning took root in the bones of the north. They said the sea had swallowed a man who dared laugh at the gods and had kept his laughter as tribute. They said a prince had slain him on sacred stone, and in doing so had cracked the boundary between the mortal and the divine. They said that when the fog rose red on certain dawns, one could still see two figures on the Stone of Odes, one standing, one falling, replaying their eternal balance. The duel was won, but the balance was broken. The oath was fulfilled, but the sea had taken note. And from that day forward, the waves of Hrafsvik carried a new sound. Not quite a song, not quite a sigh. A deep, rhythmic pulse that echoed through the cliffs at dusk, whispering to anyone who dared listen. The gods have watched. The sea has listened, and its memory has awakened. That night, after the grim ritual of the home gang and the sea burial of Kjartan Silvertooth, the man who laughed as he died, Eiríkr returned his father's hall in silence. The duel had ended at dusk, the sea painted red by both blood and sunset, and though the victor walked away, the air carried the uneasy heaviness of unfinished things. Inside the longhouse, the torches sputtered low, their flames bent by the cold draft creeping in from the fjord. The great hearth that once filled the room with the scent of pine resin now seemed dimmer, as though reluctant to burn. The hall smelled of iron, salt, and smoke. Eiríkr placed his sword upon the table, its edge dull with the blood of his enemy. Beside it lay the spoils of the fight, a heavy ring of red gold, engraved with falcons and teardrops. Jarden's prized treasure, the talisman he had claimed from some forgotten raid. It gleamed faintly even in the weak firelight, a metal too alive for comfort. He stared at it for a long time. It was not greed that tempted him, but something more primal, a strange pull, like the hush before a storm. The ring was beautiful in a way that felt wrong, beauty carved from pain. The old Skald Bjarni had warned him of such treasures. Some gold sings, he had said, and not all songs are meant for human ears. Eiríkr hesitated. Then, with a quiet exhale that sounded almost like surrender, he reached out and slipped the ring onto his finger. At once, the world changed. The air thickened. The sounds of the hall, the crackle of fire, the creak of timber, faded into an eerie stillness. Even the wind beyond the walls stopped howling. The flames shrank, curling inward upon themselves as if afraid. The warmth bled from the room, replaced by a cold so sudden and sharp it felt alive. It was not the cold of winter, but of something older, ancient, knowing, watchful. Eirikr's breath plumed white in front of him. The ring was heavy, impossibly so, as if it carried the gravity of an entire ocean. Beneath his skin, he could feel its pulse, steady deep, like a second heartbeat not his own. A sense of wrongness crept into his bones. The air itself seemed to tilt. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, and for a moment he thought he saw movement within them, subtle, fluid, like the shifting of water seen through glass. He tore his gaze away, steadying his breath. "It's done," he muttered. "Let the dead have their silence." But even as he spoke, he knew that silence was listening. He sought his bed, but sleep brought no refuge, only the continuation of the curse's quiet. His dreams were not dreams at all, but revelations. He found himself standing on a vast plain of black water that stretched endlessly in every direction. The sky above was starless, the horizon undefined. There was no wind, no sound, no movement. Even his reflection was absent. Then she appeared, a woman crowned with seaweed and stars, her body luminous yet indistinct, as if carved from light that remembered sorrow. Her face was both veiled and visible, every contour shifting between beauty and ruin. When she moved, the sea itself seemed to breathe beneath her feet. She was magnificent and terrible, the embodiment of the ocean's grief, the goddess whose tears had birthed the weeping jewel. Her eyes glowed with an ancient mourning that predated all human memory. Eiríkr tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The air around her was too dense, too sacred. She raised her hand, and in her palm shimmered the same red-gold ring that now encircled his finger. It pulsed faintly, each beat releasing a ripple that distorted the stillness. When she spoke, her voice was unlike any sound he had ever heard. It was deep and resonant, like the groan of glaciers or the whisper of the tide beneath ice. Every word seemed to echo both above and below the limits of hearing. "Return what was taken," she said, "or all warmth will dry." Her tone carried no anger, only sorrow vast enough to crush mountains. The world around her trembled. Tears spilled from her eyes, but they were not tears of water. They were droplets of pure gold, falling into the black sea and vanishing without ripple or sound. Each drop burned cold as it fell, a contradiction so profound it defied nature. Eiríkr understood dimly that this was no mortal vision. It was a message of a god, a sentence more than a warning. The threat was not death, but desiccation, the drying up of all that made life worth living. The theft was not of metal, but of meaning. He reached toward her, but she was already fading, her luminous form dissolving into mist. Only her eyes lingered, two emerald lanterns flickering in the dark. "You have taken sorrow," she whispered. Now sorrow will take you. Then she was gone. Eiríkr awoke with a violent gasp, his body drenched in cold sweat. His breath came fast, fog in the air before his face. For a moment, he did not know if he was still dreaming. The fire that should have smoldered until dawn was gone. The hearth was dead, nothing left but cold gray ash. Frost had crept across the stone walls like veins of white fire. It glittered in the moonlight, forming strange patterns, spirals, runes, sigils, none of which he recognized. He rose, shivering, and wrapped himself in a cloak. The air was colder than any winter night, sharp enough to sting the lungs. His boots crunched against a thin layer of ice that had formed on the floor stones. When he stepped into main hall, he found the same deathly stillness there. The torches had burned themselves out. The only light came from the waning moon outside, spilling silver across the floor. By the doorway stood his sister, Ursa. She was wrapped in a wool shawl, her face pale, her breath visible in the cold air. She turned at the sound of his approach, and Eiríkr froze. Her eyes, once bright as summer sky, were dull, almost colorless. "Brother," she said, her voice trembling. "I tried to cry last night." He blinked. "Cry?" "For Kjartan," she whispered. "For what happened?" "For you. For him." "But—" She faltered, her lips trembling. Nothing came. Not a single tear. It's as if my heart had forgotten how. The word struck Eiríkr harder than any blade. He looked around the hall at the frozen hearth, at the lifeless shadows, and felt the dream's echo rise within him. The goddess's words returned. Return what was taken, or all warmth will dry. He turned his gaze to his hand. The ring gleamed faintly in the moonlight. It no longer felt cold. It felt hungry. Frost was crawling along the metal surface, tiny crystalline veins radiating outward like roots searching for flesh. He felt its pull, a subtle draining, as though it drank from the warmth of his blood. The truth struck him all at once, sharp and complete. The curse had already begun. The woman in his dream had not spoken metaphorically. The ring, forged from divine tears, now drank the tears of mortals. By wearing it, he had become its conduit, the thief and the vessel of sorrow both. He had stolen the goddess's grief, and now she was taking his in return. Eiríkr staggered to the open door. The fjord lay before him, still and silver beneath the moon. A thin layer of frost glazed the sand. Even the waves moved sluggishly, as though reluctant to disturb the cold air. He fell to his knees. The sound of it, the heavy collapse of flesh and bone upon cold stone, echoed like a judgment. The world seemed to contract around that single motion, drawing breath with him and then holding it, suspended in dread. Before him lay the ring. It was no longer an ornament nor a symbol of victory. It was a thing alive, gleaming faintly with the sickly light that clings to a dying sun. The red gold metal pulsed, as if remembering a rhythm that did not belong to the mortal world. Eiríkr could not look away. He felt as though the air between his eyes and the ring had become solid, a glass of ice and grief trapping him in place. The light shimmered across its surface, subtle and wrong. For a moment, it seemed only reflection, the fire from the hearth, perhaps bending strangely. But then the motion deepened. Beneath the gold, under the engraved falcons and frozen teardrops, something stirred. A flicker, a ripple of light like movement beneath water. And then he saw it. A single tear, small as a grain of salt, rolling endlessly inside the gold, round and round, never falling, never escaping. Eiríkr's heart stilled. His mouth went dry. It was beautiful. It was monstrous. The perfection of the thing made it unbearable to behold. Beauty turned inwards upon itself, weeping forever without relief. He reached out, hesitating just above its surface. The cold radiating from the ring burned his hand before he even touched it, as though warning him that the grief within was not his to claim. Behind him, Ursa whispered his name again. Her voice trembled, her breath visible in the frozen air of the hall. "Eiríkr," she said, softer now. "Please, what have you done?" But he did not answer. His mind was far away, lost in the echo of the dream that had haunted him, the vision of the woman crowned with seaweed and stars. He could still see her tears, liquid gold falling into the abyss, and hear the voice that had spoken from that endless night. Return what was taken, or all warmth will dry. He understood now. The duel, the prophecy, even Kjartan's laughter, all of it had been the surface of a much deeper current. Every act of pride, every blow struck, every drop of bloodshed had been nothing but a prelude. The ring was not a trophy. It was a threshold, and by crossing it, by slipping it over his finger and claiming it as his own, he had awakened something vast and ancient, a grief too large for any mortal heart to bear. The weight of the unseen. The silence in the hall was unbearable. The fire that had once crackled in the hearth had dwindled to a pale, nervous flame. Its light no longer warmed the stone, but shivered upon it, flickering uncertainly, as if afraid of the air it burned in. Ursa took a hesitant step toward him. Her bare feet brushed frost on the floor. Frost inside the hall. She looked down in disbelief. The ice traced delicate veins across the flagstones, spreading outward from where her brother knelt. "Brother," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The cold, it's coming from you." But Eiríkr did not move. His eyes, wide and distant, reflected the ring's dim light like mirrors of glass. Something was whispering to him, not words exactly, but the memory of words, echoing from beneath the world. It was the same whisper that filled the tide before storms, the murmur that fishermen heard in their dreams and pretended was only wind. "You woke me." The voice was not sound. It was sensation, a vibration behind his ribs, the slow pulse of the sea's unending heart. Eiríkr tried to speak, to deny it, but his breath froze halfway through. A thin line of frost traced his lips. He felt a pressure in his chest, not pain, but an overwhelming presence, as though the air itself had become aware of him. The goddess had warned him, and the frost upon his hearth was her first reply. The hall of stillness. The transformation of the hall was slow and terrible. Every breath of warmth that had once lived there, the crackle of fire, the soft glow of torches, even the smell of oak smoke, began to fade. The shadows grew longer, sharper, more sentient. They crawled along the beams like living ink. The amber light that clung to the wooden walls fractured, bending around an invisible weight that now filled the air. The room no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like the inside of a great lung that had stopped breathing. Ursa stumbled backward, clutching her shawl tighter. Her eyes darted from the ring to her brother's face, pale and still as carved stone. "Eiríkr," she whispered again, "what curse have you brought?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw something in his eyes, a reflection that was not the fire, but a vast horizon of water under moonlight. Then he blinked, and the vision was gone, the voice beneath the ice. When the wind finally rose, it came from nowhere, a draft that slipped through the sealed walls like a sigh. It wound through the hall, snuffing out the last of the candles. The world turned silver. Outside, the snow had not yet begun to fall, yet flakes drifted to the roof beams as though gravity itself had been reversed. They hung suspended for a moment, glittering in the still air before vanishing into mist. And then, from deep within the earth, a sound began to build, low, rhythmic, almost imperceptible at first. It was the sea, not the nearby fjord, calm and frozen under the winter sky, but the memory of the sea, the endless, dark water that ran beneath all things. It rose from the cracks in the stones, from the pores in the wood, from the hollows of human breath. Ursa pressed her hands to her ears, but it made no difference. The sound was not meant for ears. It lived inside the body, in the bones. Eiríkr finally stirred. His lips parted, and a faint cloud of frost escaped as he spoke. His voice was thin, barely human. "She remembers," he murmured. Ursa took another step back. "Who?" He looked at her, and for the first time since childhood, his eyes were filled with or rather than defiance. "The one who wept," he said softly. "The one who lost what cannot be returned." His hand hovered above the ring again, trembling. "And I have stolen her grief." The awakening within. A crack ran across the hearthstone. The flame inside sputtered, then went out completely. The darkness that followed was absolute, yet within it, the ring glowed faintly, not gold now, but something colder. Its light pulsed, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Eiríkr leaned closer, unable to stop himself. In the gleam of the ring, he saw visions forming, images flickering like firelight upon water. He saw the silhouette of Jartan, his body sinking, his laughter curdling into silence. He saw the stone of oaths gleaming wet with morning blood. He saw, beneath the sea, the same crown of seaweed and stars he had glimpsed on the horizon after the duel. And then he saw her, the goddess of his dream, Freyja, though not as she was depicted in carved shrines or sagas. This was not the lover of song and beauty, but the mourner of worlds, her face veiled in ocean light. Her tears were molten gold. Each drop that fell from her eyes became a star, then sank into the black water below. When she spoke, the sound was not divine thunder, but grief softened by eternity. You were warned. Eiríkr shuddered. Then teach me, he whispered. Teach me what I must do to mend it. The voice replied, not cruelly, but with infinite sorrow. Grief cannot be mended. See Wolf. Only carried. The vision faded. The light dimmed. The cold deepened. The frost and the warning. When morning came, Hrafnsvík awoke to find every surface of Eiríkr's hall covered in rime. The walls glittered as though crusted with diamond dust. The door hinges had frozen shut. The hearth was gray and lifeless. Yet in the center of the frost, upon the table, the ring remained untouched, gleaming with impossible warmth, as if the winter feared it. Eiríkr sat beside it, unmoving, his eyes red from sleeplessness. Ursa hovered near the doorway, afraid to cross the threshold. The frost came from within, she whispered to the others later that day. It was not the storm outside, it was him, and the ring, and something that remembers. The people listened, trembling, for they too felt the change. The sea outside had frozen overnight in a strange pattern, not solid, but laced with spirals that glowed faintly at dusk, like tears caught in ice. And though no one spoke of it openly, they all knew the same truth that Eiríkr did. The goddess had answered, and her grief had come home. By the week's end, the curse of the red gold ring had settled over Hrafnsvík, a silence so deep it hollowed the world. It was not merely quiet. It was a kind of silence that devoured meaning. The fjord, once a place of music and mourning, now felt as though time itself had frozen mid-breath. It began subtly. A fisherman cut his hand on a hook and did not curse. A child fell from a low wall and rose without a cry. By the third day, the stillness had spread like frost. The laughter at the tavern ceased. The night songs faded from the hearths. Even the gulls, ever reverent, had gone mute, wheeling above the harbor like white specters. Then came the seventh day, the day when everyone understood that something irreparable had taken root. A woman gave birth that morning. The baby came into the world red and wailing, as every child should, but its cries met a room of empty eyes. No tears of relief, no laughter, no trembling hands reaching in wonder. The midwives moved mechanically, cleaning and swaddling, their movements flawless and hollow. The mother stared at her newborn with dry eyes, as though the spark of love had been erased from her heart. Later that same day, a fisherman's boat capsized near the shoal. He drowned within sight of the village. The tide brought his body home, limp and pale. The men who lifted him from the water did so with perfect calm, their faces void of grief. His wife received the body with a polite nod, then turned and walked home in silence. The funeral that followed was the most dreadful thing Eiríkr had ever seen. No wailing, no trembling voices, no weeping, only the dull thud of shovels, the scrape of sand, the mechanical murmur of ritual. Grief, once the binding force of their community, had vanished. The people of Hrafnsvík, famed across the coast for their emotional candor, their loud laughter, their loud tears, had become statues of flesh. The warmth had been drained from their souls. It was a spiritual drought more devastating than any famine. Eiríkr felt in his own chest a dryness, an aching absence where emotion should live. His heart beat, but nothing stirred within. Even as he looked upon the faces of his people, his sister, his father, his friends, he could not summon the tears he knew should come. The world had gone hollow, and at the center of that hollowness, gleaming faintly upon his finger, was a red gold ring. When the Volva came down from her lonely dwelling in the hills, the air itself seemed to change. The people turned their heads not out of curiosity, but because something ancient compelled them to. Even the sea wind faltered at her arrival. She was draped in black and gray, her cloak heavy with salt and age. Her long braid, streaked white as bone, fell over one shoulder. In her hand she carried the staff of prophecy, a length of weatherwood crowned by a cluster of amber discs that chimed with every movement, their sound clear and metallic, cutting through the suffocating quiet like the toll of a faraway bell. Her eyes were strange, neither kind nor cruel, but deep, reflecting both dawn and dusk. They seemed to see beyond the present moment, into the fabric that bound the living and the lost. She did not greet the villagers, nor waste words of comfort. She walked straight to Eiríkr. The crowd parted for her as the tide withdraws before a wave. Her gaze went first to his face, then to his hand. "You've woken Freyja's sorrow," she said. Her voice was low, but it carried easily, as though the air itself bore it forward. The amber discs on her staff chimed once, echoing her tone. Eiríkr's mouth opened, but no words came. He could not speak. He could barely feel. The Volva's eyes softened with something that was not pity, but recognition. "You think this trinket is cursed because it kills," she said, gesturing toward the ring. "But you do not yet understand. It does not kill, it remembers. It makes the world remember what the gods once wept for." She raised her staff, and the amber caught the dim sunlight, throwing streaks of gold across the gathered faces. "Listen well," she said, "for this story is older than the sea that birthed it." And so she told them. The ring, she said, had been forged not by human hand, but from divine sorrow itself. In the time before time, Freyja, lady of beauty and grief, had lost her husband Ar to the wandering stars. In her anguish, she had wept tears that fell into the ocean. Where they touched the water, they hardened into red gold, metal born of pain, molten with longing. The goddess, seeing the beauty of her own sorrow, gathered the tears and shaped them into a ring. A remembrance, a promise that even the gods could love and lose. It was not meant to be worn by mortals, for it carried a power too raw, too consuming. It was a solidified essence of divine empathy, grief eternal, transfigured into gold. Centuries later, men found it buried beneath coral and ruin. One of them, a raider named Kjartan Silvertooth, claimed it for himself. He took what no mortal should have touched, the Volva said, her voice now a whisper. And in doing so, he awakened the goddesses weeping once more. The ring had cursed him once before, twisting Kjartan's heart until all that remained was hollow triumph. The joyless kind, the kind that devours the soul even as it feeds on glory. When he died, laughing as the sea claimed him, the ring did not die with him. It waited, buried in silt and silence. The red gold jewel rested in the cold belly of the world, sleeping among bones and broken spears. It waited not for vengeance, but for recognition, for the next hand that could bear its grief without understanding it. And when Eiríkr, son of Hrod, lifted it from the earth and claimed it in ignorance, that waiting ended. The curse awoke again, not as punishment but as restoration. Balance demanded it, the voice of the Volva. "By taking it," the Volva said, her voice carrying like thunder across still air, "you have stolen the goddess's tears again, and so she has stolen yours." Her words struck the villagers like lightning. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. No one breathed. The sound of her staff hitting the frozen ground was the only thing that proved the world still turned. The amber discs that crowned her staff chimed once, faintly, like wind through bone. She was a tall figure, draped in sealskin and twilight, her hair bound with braids of gray and copper thread. Her eyes, white and clouded with sight, reflected no faces, only the restless shimmer of the sea. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, but it was thin and dry. The horror that should have come with her words found no tears to soften it. Their fear remained unspoken, locked behind faces that could no longer express sorrow. Even mothers, clutching their children, could not weep. The Volva lowered her gaze, and for a moment her voice trembled, not with fear, but pity. "You do not yet understand," she said. "This silence is not mercy. It is the memory of the goddess. You have been emptied so that the world might remember her loss. The silence of the village. The people still like figures of carved driftwood, unmoving in the pale afternoon. The smoke from the hearths hung straight and still, unbothered by wind. Even the sea seemed subdued. Its voice was distant, hushed, as though listening for its own echo. Jarl Hrolder, who had been silent throughout the Volva's revelation, stepped forward. The years of command in him were heavy, but now they sagged beneath invisible weight. His beard was streaked with white. His eyes, dry and dull, carried neither fury nor fear, only exhaustion. He looked upon his son, and the words came like stones dragged over gravel. "You will undo this," he said. "You will bury it, return it to the sea. Let it sink until even the goddess forgets it." The people stirred, faintly. The idea of simple remedy, of burying, forgetting, returning, offered comfort, but the Volva shook her head slowly. Her amber discs chimed again, a sound both delicate and dreadful. "The sea will not take it back so easily," she warned. "Its true resting place lies beyond these shores, on the Draugr. The word that froze the blood. At that name, the murmuring crowd broke into a low, uneasy hum. Draugr, the Isle of the Drowned. The word itself carried the chill of the grave. It was an old place, older than any Saga dared remember. The island had no map, no harbor. Sailors spoke it only in whispers, a shrouded rock adrift in eternal fog, where the souls of drowned kings murmured under tide. Its shores were said to be lined with bones that never dried, and its air forever damp with the sigh of unburied men. Few dared even to look in its direction when storms passed through. The Volva's mention of it was like the tolling of a bell over open water, a sound that foretold loss. She lifted her face to the gray sky. There lies the altar where the goddess first wept. It is the heart of her sorrow, sealed and tied in stone. Only there may the ring be returned. But no living soul who has gone there has ever come back. The Jarl's defiance. "Then we burn it," said the Jarl, his voice rising in defiance. "We break it, melt it. Let no cursed relic command us again." The villagers murmured in agreement. Some nodded eagerly, desperate for an end to their unease. A few even looked toward the smiths, imagining fire hot enough to erase gods. But the Volva only smiled faintly, and there was sorrow in that smile. "You cannot destroy grief," she said. "It is older than the stars and younger than your next breath. You cannot melt what was never metal. The ring is not gold. It is solidified sorrow." Her words fell like frost, delicate yet fatal. The fire that had begun to kindle in the Jarl's eyes died out. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time in his life, he looked like an old man. "Then what can we do?" he whispered. The Volva lowered her staff, and the sea wind caught her hair like the unraveling of night. "You can return it," she said. "You can carry it home." The choice of the sea wolf. Eiríkr stood in the center of the circle, surrounded by the silence of his people. He looked down at his hand, at the red gold ring glimmering faintly in the weak light. Its warmth pulsed against his skin, not like fire but like memory, a heartbeat that was not his own. He saw his father's face, lined and unreadable. He saw Ursa's eyes, dry, desperate, hollow. He saw the people of Hrafnsvik standing like stones, the life drained from them. And in that moment, he understood. The curse was not wrath. It was balance. He had taken grief from a god, and in doing so, stripped it from his own kind. The sea had simply restored equilibrium. Guilt, sharp and clean as a blade, cut through the fog of his confusion. He felt its edge slide into his heart, and with it came clarity. The burden was his. The theft was his. And so must the atonement be. He turned to the Volva, and his voice, though quiet, carried the weight of an oath. "I'll take it back." The oath that changed the wind. The words cut through the still air like a blade through glass. Heads turned sharply. The villagers' gazes snapped toward him, some with disbelief, others with awe. The sea wind rose suddenly, sweeping across the square, rattling shutters and stirring the long-dead torches. Ursa's lips parted, but no words came. The Jarl stepped forward, his hand half extended as if to stop his son. "Eiríkr." But Eiríkr did not yield. "If I must cross Hell's breath to do it," he said, voice deepening, "then I will." The moment he spoke the words, the world shifted. A sound, deep and resonant, rolled across the horizon. It came not from thunder or wind, but from the sea itself. The water beyond the fjord shuddered once, as though struck by an unseen hand. The cliffs trembled. It was not noise. It was music, a single, impossibly low note. The first note of the oldest song in existence, the song of the sea remembering its promise. The people fell to their knees. The vulva closed her eyes. "The sea accepts," she whispered, and her amber discs chimed in agreement. The pulse of the promise. Eiríkr felt the vibration travel through his boots, through his bones, through the ring that glowed now upon his hand. It was warm again, but not painfully so. The warmth of blood returned to frozen limbs. The gold shimmered with a faint inner light, as though something inside it had opened its eyes. The air was thick with salt and silence. Then, for a heartbeat, he thought he saw a movement on the horizon, a subtle flicker of pale green light, like the reflection of a crown made from seaweed and stars. It shimmered, vanished, and returned, faint and patient. The sea was watching. He felt it waiting for him, the way it waits for storms to finish, the way it waits for ships to rot. He bowed his head. "The vow is made," the vulva said. "The path is open. You are no longer the shore. Eiríkr, you walk between." The preparation. That night, the people of Hrafnsvik did not sleep. They gathered on the cliffs, watching the sea, listening to the faint hum that still lingered in the air. It was as if the ocean itself were whispering lullabies to ghosts. Eiríkr stood apart from them, sharpening his blade by lantern light. Each scrape of metal on stone sounded hollow in the airless night. Ursa came to him quietly, her hair whipped by the cold wind. "You can't go," she said softly. "You'll never come back." Eiríkr smiled faintly. "Perhaps not, but someone must carry it." She reached out, her fingers trembling. "Then let me come." He shook his head. "No, you are the heart of this village. If I fail, someone must remain to remember why." The light flickered over his face, carving deep shadows into his eyes. She saw in him the same wild calm that had always drawn him to the sea. And now, she realized, it was a calm of a man who had already begun to say goodbye to life. She pressed her forehead against his. "Then promise me," she whispered, "that if the goddess takes you, you will not forget us." He did not answer in words, but his silence was a promise. The sea's reply. At dawn, the sky bloomed with color, bands of gold and rose that turned the water to molten glass. The entire village stood on the shore as Eiríkr stepped into his boat. The red gold ring gleamed like a living thing against the dull gray of his hand. The vulva raised her staff, and her voice rose above the wind. "Bear her sorrow, sea wolf, and may you teach the world to weep again." Eiríkr pushed from the shore. The boat glided over the mirrored surface of the fjord, each ripple spreading like the echo of a heartbeat. Behind him, the villagers stood in silence, their eyes dry but their chests heavy with something that might one day become tears. As the boat drifted farther, the sound came again, that deep, eternal hum, the sea's approval. It vibrated through the cliffs, through the bones of the earth, through every soul in Hrafnsvik. Even the unborn felt it, a pulse older than language. The Jarl closed his eyes and bowed his head. Ursa pressed her hand to her heart, and as the boat grew smaller on the horizon, they all saw the same thing, a faint light spreading beneath the waves, like gold dissolving into green. The goddess was waiting. The vow had been heard. The path was open. And so began the journey of the sea wolf, to return sorrow to the sea and to teach the world how to weep again. The departure from Hrafnsvik was as silent and devoid of fanfare as a funeral. Eiríkr, bearing the burden of the weeping jewel, set sail not on his father's magnificent longship, but on a smaller, swift vessel built for speed and stealth. His quest was personal, and the company he kept was meticulously chosen, each person selected not for their strength in the shield wall, but for their mastery of the strange and the necessary. He sailed with 3 companions, a fellowship of shadows and specialized skill. Scory the Silent, a man whose presence was as unobtrusive as falling snow. His moniker was earned because, in battle, he never shouted, and in camp, he never spoke more than strictly necessary. His value was in his lethal precision. His arrows never missed. It was said he didn't aim at the target, but at the empty space where the target was going to be on this voyage. He was a guard against whatever vengeful spirits or desperate men the cursed isles might harbor. Bjarni Quick Hands, the rogue, the trickster, whose hands moved faster than the eye could follow. Bjarni's ability was more than simple theft. It was a mastery of misdirection and subtle intervention. He could steal a flame without burning, lift the shoes from a sleeping man, or slip the knot from a tightening noose. He was brought along to navigate the magical snares and spectral traps that were rumored to protect the Draugr Holmi, a Slog, the smith's daughter, the most unlikely warrior, yet perhaps the most vital. A Slog possessed a raw, elemental power, a deep understanding of fire and metal inherited from her trade. She was the only one in Hrafnsvik who seemed untouched by the curse, her spirit too vibrant to be dampened. Her laughter made sparks obey, a joyous, reckless sound that was the last vestige of warmth Eiríkr heard before leaving the bay. She carried Tool's fire and the hope of resistance, the haunted trail. Their voyage was immediately marked by the uncanny. They followed not the familiar stars or the known coastal landmarks, but trail of ghostly lights, the vidi or signposts of the drowned, that danced just beyond reach, beckoning them deeper into the unknown northern waters. These lights were ethereal, flickering on the periphery of vision, ensuring they followed the path of the dead. The sea, Eiríkr's kin and mirror, was now his constant, unpredictable guide. Some nights, the ocean beneath them betrayed its natural coldness. It glowed with a faint, eerie green fire, the bioluminescence a ghostly reflection of the lost souls below. The light pulsed, illuminating the hull of their ship in an unnatural hue, turning the faces of the crew into masks of emerald shadow. It was a glow of the world's deepest, most hidden sorrows. Other nights, when the surface was smooth as glass, massive, dark shapes would follow close beneath them. Whales followed close, not in silence, but in communion. They were ancient creatures, the living memory of the sea, and they hummed old songs, songs of creation, of storm, and of the first men who sailed. Eiríkr, attuned to the water's voice, felt the vibration of their song to the keel, recognizing them as protective escorts, guiding them through the hostile waters toward the place of ultimate sorrow. Day blurred into night, marked only by the shifting intensity of the magical phenomena. The tension among the crew was a taut bowstring, but their faith in Eiríkr and his silent connection to the sea remained absolute. The Draugr Holmi, the island of the dead. On the seventh day, the world around them dissolved into an oppressive, choking gray. The air went still, heavy and wet, the dreaded blinding fog of the ancient sea. They sailed blind for hours, guided only by the distant, mournful humming of the whales. Then, with a sudden, sharp, and terrifying violence, the fog opened like a mouth. They saw it. It was an island of black rock, the color of cooled lava and eternal shadow. It did not merely sit in the sea. It rose from the sea like a tomb refusing to stay buried. Its cliffs were sheer, unscalable surfaces, its peaks jagged, looking like the broken teeth of a colossal, drowned beast. It was a Draugr Holmi, the Isle of the Walking Dead, the haunted sanctuary of the Draugr, the ancient, restless kings who ruled the dark, salty depths. The moment the island was revealed, all natural movement ceased. The last whisper of air departed. The wind died completely. Their sail hung limply, and the waves vanished, leaving the ship becalmed on a slick, dark surface of water. The silence was heavier than any storm. But beneath the water, the silence was betrayed. A deep, slow, and terrifying rhythm began to vibrate to the hull of their ship, a sound of immense scale, felt more than heard. Something below the waves began to breathe. It was not the sigh of the tide or the exhalation of a whale, but the slow, powerful inhalation and exhalation of the island itself, or of whatever monstrous, primeval entity was shackled beneath it. Eiríkr looked down at his hand. The red gold ring pulsed with a cold light. He had crossed the breath of hell and reached the resting place of Freyja's tears. The final reckoning was at hand, and the ancient, slumbering power of the haunted isles had just registered their arrival. They landed at dusk, the worst possible time, the hour when the boundaries between the worlds of the living and the dead were thinnest, when the Draugr were strongest. The transition from the becalmed sea to the island's shore was unsettlingly easy, almost as if the island itself had drawn their small vessel to its black shingle beach. The stones underfoot pulsed faintly, a sensation Eiríkr felt through the thick leather of his boots. It was a rhythmic throb, slow and deep, mirroring the breathing he felt beneath the waves. The island was alive, and the stones seemed to be remembering footsteps. Footsteps that had passed this way centuries ago. Perhaps the dead kings returned to their tombs, or the doomed pilgrims who sought the oracle here long before Kjartan defiled the site. The beach itself was narrow, giving way immediately to a sudden, vertical rise of smooth black rock, seemingly leading nowhere. But centered in that wall of stone was a structure both natural and utterly intentional, an arch of coral and bone. It was vast, wide enough for a funeral procession, formed from the bleached, interlocking skeletons of immense, unknown sea creatures, and reinforced with deep-sea coral that glowed faintly. It stood like the gaping maw of a leviathan, leading into absolute darkness. The keeper of sparks and the cold fire. "This is her gate," whispered Aslog, the smith's daughter, her voice hollowed by the acoustic dread of the place. Her usual bright, sparking laughter was gone, replaced by a profound solemnity. She was the one who understood the elementals, and this structure felt less like a tomb entrance and more like a carefully guarded portal to a power that demanded silence. Bjarni and Skori flanked Eiríkr, their weapons drawn but useless in the face of such ancient, spiritual architecture. Eiríkr stepped forward alone. He carried the red gold ring cupped in both hands, a gesture of offering, not possession. He felt the jewel's profound coldness intensify. It burned cold, a fierce, spiritual frost against his palms. The object's strange, deep light, the sorrow of a goddess, was bleeding between his fingers, staining the air around him with a luminous, melancholy hue. He could feel the ring's power, the accumulated grief of the world's most beautiful goddess, resisting its return to its source. It was a weeping heart fighting its way home. He crossed the threshold. The air inside the archway was immediately different, thick and heavy. It smelled of rain long forgotten, not the scent of dampness, but the residue of profound, dried-up sorrow, the smell of the curse that had fallen upon Hrafnsvik. The cave was enormous, a cathedral carved by eons of wave action. It was dark, yet illuminated by a stunning, impossible phenomenon. The high, vaulted walls dripped light instead of water. Small phosphorescent motes, like tiny stars, detached themselves from the rock and fell silently to the floor, where they vanished. The entire space was lit by this soft, ambient, cascading glow, a light made of the same sorrow that pulsed in the ring. The figure and the vow. In the center of the vast chamber, lying on a pedestal of smooth black stone, lay the object of his quest. It was not a statue nor a corpse, but a figure of a woman crowned in shell and shadow. She was carved from an opaque, milky material, perhaps ancient ivory or bone, and covered in barnacles and rare, black shells. She was immense, the size of a longship, and possessed a majestic, overwhelming presence. She was the queen of the drowned, the physical manifestation of Freyja's grief, the silent priestess who guarded the origin of the weeping jewel. Her eyes were sculpted closed, yet Eiríkr felt instantly that she was profoundly awake beneath the lid. Keenly aware of his presence, his sin, and his intention, Eiríkr approached the altar stone, his boots silent on the smooth floor. He knelt, bowing his head to the power he had unwittingly challenged. The cold of the ring intensified until his hands felt numb, utterly divorced from his body. He raised his voice not in fear, but in the respectful reverence of a supplicant. His words, though spoken softly, echoed throughout the vast cavern, resonating with the sound of the dripping light. "Queen of the drowned," said Eiríkr softly, his breath misting the chilling air, "I have brought home what was stolen." He placed a red gold ring gently onto the altar stone at the figure's feet. The moment the ring left the skin, a blinding, silent flash of emerald light filled the cave, and the pulsing of the island stopped. The air seemed to inhale sharply, sucking in the last vestiges of forgotten rain. Eiríkr waited, heart pounding, for the curse to be lifted, or for the wrath of the awakened goddess to claim his life. The silence that followed was terrifying, an absolute void of sound where the wind, the sea, and the breath of the island had been. He had returned the heart. Now he awaited the verdict. The moment Eiríkr placed the ring upon the altar, the silence that followed his vow was immense, an ancient silence, vast and dense enough to have gravity. Even the air seemed to recoil, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then, suddenly, that stillness shattered, not with sound, but with sight. The immense carved queen of the drowned, whose stone body had for ages seemed inert, opened her eyes. They were not made of coral or shell, nor of any mortal element. They were made of light, sea-green and fathomless, rippling with the motion of unseen tides. The light within them shifted like water over glass, at once tranquil and furious, infinite and intimate. The glow illuminated the temple walls, transforming the salt-encrusted carvings into living things. The forms of whales and drowned kings seemed to move, the stone rippling like skin. The entire structure trembled. Outside the archway, the ocean itself answered. From the depths came a soundless convulsion, a surge of movement, a pulse through the deep. The sea rose, a single tidal wave that curled but did not break, as if bowing to the reawakened queen. The very cave quaked with its acknowledgment. Eiríkr fell to his knees, his head bowed, salt water running from his hair like tears not yet his own. The goddess spoke. Her voice was not thunder. It was something far more terrible, a closeness, a whisper so deep it bypassed ears and entered directly into the marrow. It carried sorrow like cold carries death. "You cannot return what you become," she said. The words struck not with force, but with inevitability, like the tide reclaiming the shore. They resonated through Eiríkr's bones, each syllable layered with eons of grief. The sound was both intimate and infinite, the voice of the sea murmuring in every drop of his blood. "You wore my grief," she continued, "and now it lives in you." It was not accusation, it was truth. The act of wearing the stolen jewel had not merely borrowed her sorrow, it had rewritten him. The divine sadness had woven itself into his being, a thread that could never be pulled free. Eiríkr remained kneeling. He did not argue. He understood that no plea, no apology could undo what he had become. Yet he was not ready to surrender, not while the curse still strangled his people. "Then take it back," he said, voice breaking but steady. "Take all that I have, all that I am. Just let them live." The queen's eyes deepened, their light darkening to a fierce, green-black storm. When she looked into him, he felt himself unmade. His memories peeled away like layers of bark, his youth, his victories, even his pride, until nothing remained but the naked pulse of his heart. Then she asked the question that would decide everything. "Can you weep for those not your own?" It was both challenge and invitation. The weight of her words filled the chamber until it seemed no air remained. Eiríkr understood. The ring had not merely stolen tears. It had stolen empathy, the capacity to feel sorrow beyond the self. The people of Hrafsvik no longer wept for others, no longer shared pain. Their hearts had become islands. To restore balance, he would have to weep for all of them, for his father, his sister, his people, his enemies. He would have to weep not for himself, but through himself. He closed his eyes and thought first of Ursa, his sister, once fierce and laughing, now hollow-eyed, her laughter gone silent. He thought of his father, Jarl Hrolder, standing on the cliffs each night, staring into the sea with dry eyes, unable even to mourn the dying of his soul. He thought of the children whose faces were blank as snow, who fell and bled without tears. And then, as if summoned by memory, he saw Kjartan Silvertooth, the raider he had slain, the man who had laughed as he died, his mirth born of despair, his joy twisted by the curse. That laughter had been a mockery of life, a hymn to emptiness. In that instant, Eiríkr understood the full extent of what had been lost. The curse had not stolen joy, it had stolen connection. Without sorrow, the people could no longer love. He bowed his head, his body trembling. The first sound that escaped him was not a sob, but a gasp, raw and jagged, as though his chest had split open. It was not his eyes that broke first, but his throat. The cry that followed was not human, not a sound of fear, but of recognition. It was the sound of the world remembering how to grieve. The tears came next, slow at first, heavy, deliberate, as though drawn up from the deep places of the earth. They were cold, ancient, and endless. They streamed down his face, each drop a relic of the sorrow the ring had stolen. When the first tear struck the red gold metal of the ring upon the altar, it did not wet the surface. It hissed. The contact of mortal sorrow and divine grief sparked light, pure, white gold and searing. More tears fell, and with each one, the ring glowed brighter, as if the goddess herself were being fed by his empathy. The air filled with a hum, a resonance like 1,000 heartbeats pulsing in unison. The light grew unbearable, flooding the cavern, making the carved walls shimmer like the surface of the sea in full sun. Eiríkr did not stop. He wept until his body shook, until every breath felt like drowning and resurrection at once. He wept for his people. He wept for Chartan. He wept for the sea. He wept for every heart that had ever forgotten how. And through those tears, the goddess's light began to change. The storm within her eyes softened. The green turned translucent, the color of shallow waters at dawn. Slowly, her colossal form seemed to lean forward, not in wrath, but in recognition. A faint smile, barely a movement, touched her lips. "You have remembered how to hurt beautifully," she said. Her voice, now gentle as surf against stone, rippled through the chamber. The light in her eyes dimmed to a calm gleam, and with it, the tremor in the walls subsided. The glow of the ring faded from blinding gold to a quiet ember. The hiss became silence. The hum became breath. Eiríkr fell forward, hands braced on the cold stone of the altar. His body was shaking, but his mind was clear. The air had changed. It smelled of rain again, that clean, living scent of the world renewed. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the coral walls were weeping too. Droplets of seawater rolled down their surfaces, catching the light in tiny glimmers. Even the temple itself seemed to sigh. The queen's face was still once more, carved, serene, and eternal. But her presence lingered, filling the space like music after the final note. Eiríkr rose unsteadily to his feet. The red gold ring sat before him on an altar, no longer cursed, no longer hungry. It was quiet now, its sorrow transmuted into stillness. He picked it up. It was warm for the first time. He turned toward the archway of coral and bone, where the light of the sea filtered through like the first dawn after endless night. Behind him, the goddess's whisper followed, faint but unmistakable. "Go, sea wolf. Carry what you have learned. My grief now breathes through you." Eiríkr bowed deeply, tears still streaking his face. He understood that he would never be free of her sorrow, but neither would he be consumed by it. He was now the vessel, the conduit, the balance between mortal empathy and divine ache. The curse had been broken not through defiance, but through surrender, not by returning the gold, but by offering the only treasure the sea had ever envied, the ability to feel. As he stepped through the archway, the tide's cold breath kissed his face, and he inhaled deeply. Outside, the dawn waited. The first true wind in a week touched his hair, carrying the clean scent of the living sea. Eiríkr smiled faintly, exhausted yet whole. He had brought the goddess her tears, and in doing so, he had returned the world its heart. He was no longer only the sea wolf. He was the bearer of sorrow, and through that sorrow, the keeper of peace. When Eiríkr and his companions emerged from the archway of coral and bone, the world had been remade. They stood blinking in the dim, golden half-light of a newborn dawn, their lungs burning with the shock of clean air. The profound silence and the freezing dread that had ruled the Draugr were gone. The oppressive weight, the spectral whisper of 1,000 lost voices, had vanished as though swallowed by time itself. And the most startling change of all, the island was gone. Where once the black cliff of the Isle of the Drowned had loomed, dark as obsidian, carved by the sorrow of centuries, there was now nothing but a small sandy shoal. The monstrous spires, the twisted bones of ships that jutted from its shores, the accursed mist that wrapped it, all had dissolved. No trace remained, not even a ripple or a shadow. It was as if the island had never existed, erased by the same forces that had once called it forth. Eiríkr stood barefoot on the wet sand, staring at the horizon. The sea around them stretched flat and calm as glass, reflecting the early light like polished metal. It was so still that the reflection of the men was unbroken, perfect, and eerily serene. There was silence, but not the dreadful, devouring silence that had haunted them. This was a silence of peace, a silence earned. The sea lay still, as if in shame for its past fury, its once raging surface now gentle, contrite. The curse was ended. The payment had been made. Bjarni Quickhands was the first to find his voice. "She's gone," he murmured. staring at the horizon. Scory the silent, ever the stoic, only nodded, as she was meant to be. The air smelled new. Gone was the sharp metallic tang that had filled their lungs during the curse's reign, the taste of rust, blood, and despair. In its place was something lighter, cleaner. The air had flavor again. It tasted like snow melt, like pine, like the first breath taken after fever. They wasted no time. Bjarni took the oars, his deft movements confident even after the trials of the underworld. Scory checked the ropes, his expression unreadable but his posture reverent, as if he feared to disturb the fragile perfection of the morning. The little boat cut to the mirror-like water, each oar stroke leaving a trail of molten gold. Above them, the dawn unfurled, a sky painted in copper and rose, glowing with a kind of beauty that feels almost too tender to touch. Eiríkr sat at the bow, silent, his thoughts heavy and bright all at once. He could feel the faint hum of the weeping jewel still echoing in his chest. It was no longer pain. It was memory, the residue of divine sorrow, now part of his own heartbeat. They rowed toward home under a sky the color of burnished copper, a warm and living hue utterly unlike the cursed red gold of the ring. The air was soft, the wind favorable, and the tide seemed to carry them forward with gentle insistence. For the first time in days, perhaps years, they laughed. It was not the nervous, forced laughter of men warding off dread, but the unrestrained joy of those who have glimpsed death and returned bearing the truth. When the coast of Hrafsvik appeared on the horizon, it shimmered like a vision. The mountains behind the fjord glowed faintly pink under the newborn light, and the water, once a mirror of sorrow, now breathed with color. Then came the sound. A gull cried somewhere in the distance. It was a simple thing, a small, everyday noise that once would have gone unnoticed, but to Eiríkr it was a revelation. He had not heard that cry for what felt like a lifetime. During the curse, even the gulls had fallen silent, as if afraid to disturb the dead air. Now the sound was full, wild, hungry, alive. It was the cry of life itself resuming its course. He laughed quietly, head tilted to the sky. "The world remembers how to sing," he said. When at last their boat reached the beach of Hrafsvik, the village awaited them. Smoke rose from hearths again. The scent of cooking drifted on the wind. Fish, bread, broth, the ordinary miracles of the living. And as they stepped onto the sand, the first sound that greeted them was the sound of weeping. Children weeping over scraped knees as they played. Women weeping with joy at the sight of their returning sons. Old men weeping quietly as they clasped one another's hands. The air was thick with tears, not of despair but of restoration. Every sob, every trembling breath was proof that the hearts of Hrafsvik had remembered how to feel. The village, once a hollow echo, now pulsed again with humanity. At the top of the stone ramp stood Jarlrold, Eiríkr's father. He was thinner now, frail from the long blight of emotionlessness, but his eyes shone with wetness. As Eiríkr approached, the old Jarl stepped forward with surprising steadiness. He reached out, his hand trembling, and rested it upon his son's shoulder. "You brought back more than tears, my son," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You've brought back the part of us that remembers what it means to live." Eirikr's eyes met his father's. They were not the eyes of a conqueror or a hero. They were the eyes of a man who had faced the abyss and returned with humility. His face bore the marks of exhaustion, but also of peace. "We brought back the part of the heart that breaks and lives," he answered softly, "the part that listens." The Jarl's gaze wavered, filling again. He nodded once, unable to speak further. Behind him stood the Volva, the seeress whose amber discs chimed faintly whenever she moved. Her long gray hair fluttered like smoke in the wind, and her gaze was fixed not on the returning men, but on the sea. She alone understood what the others could not, that the sea never gives without asking something in return. As the villagers celebrated, laughing and crying in the same breath, the Volva's eyes narrowed. The water at the horizon glittered too perfectly. There was still power there. Waiting, she stepped forward, her voice low but carrying, woven with the rhythm of waves. "Joy returns and sorrow sleeps," she said. "But do not forget, the sea always asks for its echoes." The laughter faltered. For a moment, all sound seemed to still. Even the gulls grew quiet, circling above in uneasy silence. Eiríkr turned to her, his brow furrowing. He understood enough of the old ways to know that every blessing bore its cost. "What echoes?" he asked quietly. The vulva's eyes did not leave the water. "The ocean has memory," she said. "It holds what we give it. Your offering was accepted, your sorrow weighed and found purer. But sorrow echoes. The sea will remember your tears, and one day it will ask for them again." Eiríkr stood in silence, absorbing her words. Behind him, the villagers resumed their rejoicing, though more softly now, more reverently. He looked out the fjord, where the tide lapped gently at the sand. The surface was calm, almost too calm. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw something shimmer beneath it, a faint golden flicker, like sunlight refracted through tears. Then it was gone. He bowed his head. "Then I will listen when she speaks again," he said. The vulva inclined her head. "And that is why she chose you." That night, when darkness fell, Hrafnsvik glowed with light. Fires burned high. Songs rose and laughter filled the air. It was not the mindless celebration of those who had forgotten danger. It was the gratitude of those who had lived to feel again. Eiríkr sat apart for a while, watching the flames flicker in the reflection of the water. His heart was full, but beneath the joy, a quiet awareness stirred. The sea was calm now, but it was not done. In the depths, the ocean dreamed. And in its dreams, sorrow slept, not dead but patient. The curse was lifted, the payment made. But the sea would never forget. For every calm tide remembers the storm that shaped it. And so, as Hrafnsvik rejoiced, Eiríkr, the sea wolf, the keeper of silence, kept watch, his gaze upon the horizon, knowing that the greatest peace is always the one that listens for its echo. For a season, peace held Hrafnsvik in its warm, fragile embrace. The long shadow of sorrow withdrew at last, leaving behind a brightness that almost felt unreal to those who had survived the storm. The village breathed again. The scent of salt and pine mingled with the fragrance of baking bread, and laughter once more echoed along the narrow streets. The sound of children running barefoot on the docks replaced the memory of cries carried by the wind. It was as if the world itself exhaled. The people of Hrafnsvik rebuilt their lives with quiet gratitude. Nets were mended, boats restored, and songs once reserved for funerals found new verses, ones of resilience and rebirth. Men no longer cursed the sea. They greeted it each morning as one greets a friend whose temper has finally cooled. When dawn broke, the fjord shimmered with light, its waters calm and reflective, as though the sea itself wished to admire the peace it had helped create. And in the heart of this renewal stood Eiríkr and a slog, no longer haunted, no longer merely survivors, but the twin pillars of village reborn. In the spring that followed, a celebration was held to mark the end of the dark period, a joining of hearts and destinies that would seal the new balance. Beneath a sky painted with ribbons of green and pink light, Eiríkr and a slog wed. The northern lights streamed low across the heavens, luminous and alive. They pulsed like breath, soft, rhythmic, tender, wrapping the fjord in a celestial glow. Old women whispered that it was Freyja's veil, laid gently over the world to bless what had once been broken. The goddess was present, not in thunder or vision, but in warmth, the subtle pulse of joy that stirred in every chest. The sea, too, celebrated. Waves lapped gently at the rocks, forming a music that matched the harp's slow rhythm. Nets cast the next morning came back heavy with silver fish, gleaming like fragments of starlight. Children swore that even the gulls sang sweeter that day. For the first time in many generations, Hrafnsvik feasted not to appease the sea, but to thank it. Eiríkr stood before his people, tall, steady, his once wild eyes now calm as winter's mirror. He was no longer the restless Jarl's son, but a man who had found stillness within himself. The sea had given him its rhythm, a slog, its joy. Her laughter rang through the crowd, clear as hammered silver, and the people said that sound alone could calm the tide. Together they ruled, not as sovereigns, but as stewards of equilibrium. Eiríkr's authority was quiet, like the weight of the mountains, and the slog's was bright, like flame caught in crystal. They governed not through fear, but through understanding. Under their care, Hrafnsvik thrived. Yet peace, as all things mortal, is delicate. It was a thin skin stretched over an ocean of memory, and beneath that stillness, something vast continued to move. Sometimes, When night fell too perfectly still and the wind ceased their sighing, Eiríkr would sit awake, listening. The bay, calm and glassy, reflected every star. The hush was complete, too complete, and in that silence he would hear it. Faint laughter, carried from far out over the water. It was not cruel laughter, not mocking as before. It was lonely, a hollow sound shaped by longing, echoing through the emptiness where the cursed owl had once stood. Eiríkr recognized the voice immediately. Jartan Silvertooth, the raider whose death had torn open the veil between the mortal and divine. The man who had died laughing into the storm, proud and unrepentant, his final breath stolen by the sea. Now his laughter came not as a curse, but as a reminder, a ghostly refrain from the deep. The ocean, Eiríkr realized, was collecting its debts. The laughter was only the first echo returning home. One evening, as the summer waned and the air turned sharp with coming frost, Eiríkr sat outside his home mending the ropes of his ship. The sky glowed faintly violet, the hour between sunset and darkness when the world seems to hold its breath. He worked quietly, fingers tracing the thick, salt-stiff cords, his thoughts drifting like the tide. Near him lay the patch of earth where he had buried the red gold ring, the weeping jewel that had once bound the fate of gods and men. He had chosen the spot carefully, where sea and land met, where it could rest close enough to be honored but far enough to be still. He thought often of that act, not as renunciation, but as trust. But as he reached for a coil of rope, something caught his eye, a glimmer at the edge of sight, faint yet undeniable, a flash of color beneath the soil. He froze. The ring, it lay half exposed, gleaming faintly in the twilight. The earth around had shifted, perhaps from rain, perhaps from something deeper stirring beneath. Its surface pulsed with dull light, the shade of old blood and memory. For a long moment, he could not move. The air itself seemed to recoil in expectation. Then, slowly, almost against his will, he reached down and brushed away the remaining dirt. His fingers trembled as they closed around the cold metal. The instant he touched it, the warmth left the world. The night air turned brittle. The gentle hum of the hearths, the quiet chatter of distant homes. All fell silent. Crickets ceased their song. Even the fire inside his house flickered low, as though unwilling to intrude. Far out on the fjord, thunder rolled, a single, resonant boom that shook the water's skin. There was no storm in the sky, no lightning, no cloud, only that immense hollow voice, echoing through the dark. The sea was speaking. Eiríkr felt its meaning not in his ears, but in his bones. It was neither anger nor accusation. It was acknowledgment. The balance had shifted. The sea remembered. He lifted the ring. Its weight familiar, its chill ancient. It was unchanged, smooth, cold, perfect. Yet beneath that perfection pulsed something alive. "She's remembering," he whispered to the stillness. He did not speak her name aloud, but he knew. Freyja, the Queen of Sorrows. He gazed out the horizon where the water and sky merged into infinite dusk. Or maybe, he murmured, she never forgot. The words carried on the wind, faint as breath, and for an instant he thought he heard a sigh answer him. From the sea itself, from the goddess, or perhaps from the part of himself that would always belong to both. He sat there a long time, the ring cold in his palm, the sea before him endless and knowing. He felt not fear, but gravity, the pull of understanding that all peace is conditional, all healing incomplete. The curse had not ended. It had transformed. What once was torment was now duty. The weeping jewel had returned to him not as punishment, but as reminder. Its light no longer sought destruction, but vigilance. It was the ocean's way of saying, balance must be kept. Eiríkr understood then that he was not merely the man who made the sea gentle. He was its keeper still, guardian of the fragile thread between joy and grief, love and loss, chaos and calm. He slipped the ring onto his finger once more. The cold spread through him, not painful now, but clarifying, anchoring him to the eternal rhythm that no mortal heart could fully contain. The sea stirred, a single wave rolling toward him, touching his boots with deliberate tenderness before withdrawing. A whisper rode upon it. "We remember." Eiríkr closed his eyes. In the depths of that whisper he heard every voice, the dead, the living, the goddess, and even his own. He smiled, weary and luminous in the faint auroral glow. "Then I remember too," he said softly, and the balance held. That night, long after the village had gone to sleep, a slog awoke to find the fire in their hearth burning lower than usual. Through the open door, she saw her husband sitting at the edge of the water, his face lit faintly by the ring's golden light. He was not weeping. He was listening. The sea hummed around him, vast and tender, and though she could not hear its words, she knew, with a certainty beyond reason, that her husband was not alone. The peace they had built would endure, but only so long as the keeper's heart remained vigilant. And so, the man who once tamed the sea now kept its memory, forever bound to its sorrow, its beauty, and its song. That winter, when the light was weakest and the cold was harshest, strangers came to Hrafsvik. They were not merchants or raiders, but tax collectors, men wearing the king's crest, symbols of a distant, encroaching authority. They demanded a ruinous tribute, vast quantities of iron and labor, crippling the village's ability to survive the long, cold months. The people of Hrafsvik, instinctively cautious of the crown, bowed their heads in wary silence. Their Jarl was old, and the king's power was absolute. They had only just recovered their emotional warmth. They did not wish to lose their physical security. The captain leading the levy was a man whose arrogance was as sharp as his spurs. He smirked, taking in the simple wealth of the bay, his elaborate, plumed helmet catching the firelight of the Jarl's hall, casting arrogant shadows. "Your fjord is rich. Your Jarl is weak," the captain declared, his voice full of casual contempt. He saw them as easy prey, their newfound emotional vulnerability mistaken for weakness. Eiríkr stepped forward, standing between the captain and his people. He was imposing, his blade sheathed, a sign that his preference was for peace, not that he was unarmed. The weight of the weeping jewel's memory gave his presence a cold, quiet gravity. "We give what we owe, not what you dream," Eiríkr stated, his voice calm, rooted in the hard law of the fjord. He was willing to pay a fair tax, but not to surrender Hrafsvik's self-sufficiency. The captain's eyes narrowed, his smirk deepening into a sneer. He was not here for negotiation. He was here to demonstrate power. "Then pay with your pride," he sneered, viewing the sea-wolf's defiance as a delightful challenge. The unbroken heart. The captain, taking Eiríkr's silence for acceptance, raised his staff, intending to strike the ground and assert the king's claim. But Eiríkr's warning was not an isolated act of defiance. The villagers, no longer hollowed by the curse, reacted with immediate, vibrant solidarity. In the kitchens, women beat pots like war drums. Children, recently recovered from their dry-eyed stupor, ran out and shouted with reckless, rediscovered emotion. The men who had been holding their breath now lifted tools as weapons, axes, hammers, and harpoons, a sudden, unified wall of defiance. They were no longer afraid to feel or to fight for what they felt. Then Ursa stepped forward. She had been closest to the chilling curse, and she understood the power of the sea's symbols better than anyone. She carried a wooden bucket and, with a silent, deliberate motion, poured seawater at the captain's feet. "Walk softly," she said, her voice low and steady. It was a local warning against hubris, a plea to respect the sea's power. The arrogant captain, dismissive of a woman in water, took a clumsy step forward into the slick pool. His heavy military boots had no purchase on the icy, salty pavement. He slipped, stumbled, his plumed helmet tipping forward as he flailed, crashing to the ground in a graceless heap. The sight of the king's authority literally brought low. Defeated by a bucket of salt water was too much. The whole village laughed like thunder, a deep, cleansing, joyous sound, roaring with recovered humanity and collective victory. It was the sound of the curse being permanently undone. Pride broke, the captain's pride shattered by ridicule. But peace held. The conflict was settled without a sword ever leaving its sheath. Eiríkr had brought back the heart that breaks and lives, and that heart knew exactly how to defend itself against tyranny, not just with steel, but with solidarity and the potent, unyielding spirit of the sea. Years passed. The harsh winters and fertile summers turned over, each one adding to the wisdom and resilience of Hrafsvik. The peace Eiríkr had fought for was not merely a pause in conflict. It was profound, enduring stability. Jarl Hrold died in the fullness of time, having watched his son mature into a true leader. He died with his eyes wet, a sign that the curse had been truly vanquished and that his final, honest grief was his own. His last, loving act was whispering his son's name, Eiríkr. A peaceful passing that the villagers wept over openly and without shame. Eiríkr, the keeper. Eiríkr ruled not merely as a jarl, the military and legal chief, but as the keeper, a title earned through his intimate knowledge of the boundary between the mortal and the divine. He was a keeper of songs, ensuring the old stories were told to remember courage, not just glory. The keeper of nets, ensuring the practical needs of the village were met. And most importantly, the keeper of balance, maintaining the delicate harmony between the fjord and the wild sea. He often walked to the shore, a solitary ritual that had defined his life since childhood. He spoke softly to the tide as if to an old friend, acknowledging its power, its memory, and its endless, shifting moods. He never forgot the cold fire of the weeping jewel or the price of the sea's echoes. Sometimes, the water would answer his quiet words not with roar or threat, but with small ripples shaped like laughter, the echo of Kjartan, now softened and tamed by time and forgiveness. He fulfilled the goddess's demand in ways far exceeding the ritual. He taught his people to cry without shame, celebrating the catharsis of grief. He taught them to love without fear of loss, understanding that the pain of separation was a testament to the depth of connection. And he taught them to tell stories, not for hollow glory or boastful pride, but for remembering the truth of their journey, including the sorrow and the fear, the fruits of the voyage. The companions who sailed to the Draugr each found their peace and purpose in Hrafsvik. Skorri the Silent married a woman whose speech was perpetually woven into riddles. Their life together was a quiet, constant challenge of understanding, a perfect match for the man who saw the truth in silence. Bjarni Quickhands traded his nimble fingers for a nimble tongue. He became the village storyteller, his tales now capturing complexity of courage and emotion rather than the simplicity of theft. His quick hands, now still, amplified the dramatic pauses in his narrative. A Slaug continued her trade, but with a new, sacred focus. She forged bells that were hung above the harbor. They sang when the wind changed, serving as both a practical weather warning and a beautiful, musical reminder of the mutable, ever-present power of the sea. The legacy of Eiríkr, the sea wolf who became the keeper, was the preservation of the human heart, capable of both breaking and living beautifully. One night, the settled peace of Hrafsvik was violently broken. A storm rose from the deep without the usual preamble of wind or darkening clouds. It was a tempest born purely of the sea's own will, an act of sheer, spontaneous power. The chaos was internal. Lightning crawled across the water like thought, branching across the dark surface in silent, searing lines, illuminating the inner turmoil of the ocean itself. From a churning surf stepped a shape, a form that was neither fully woman nor wave, but an impossible, breathtaking synthesis of both. She was made of foam, salt, and starlight, the sea's power given conscious form. Freyja's presence flooded the air, overwhelming the senses with duality of sensations. Intense, sweet perfume, the center of tears and sorrow, mixed with the biting sting of deep-sea frost. The goddess stopped before Eiríkr, who had instinctively walked to the shore to face the inevitable. "You've learned sorrow," she said, her voice like the grinding of pebbles on 100 beaches. "Now learn silence." Eiríkr, standing firm in the face of the ultimate power, the keeper who understood balance, bowed his head in acceptance. He sought not to defeat her, but to understand. "If silence is peace, teach me," he replied, a statement of willing discipleship. The goddess corrected his mortal perception. "Silence," she said, her voice becoming the soft shush of the retreating tide, "is knowing when to let the sea speak first." It was a final lesson. The ultimate act of leadership was not commanding or acting, but listening, submitting the human will to the greater, primal truth of nature. She reached out and touched his brow with a cold, impossibly delicate hand. The effect was absolute. Everything went still. The raging waves stopped mid-motion, held frozen in crystalline crests. The fire in the village hearts froze mid-flame, colors locked in amber. The world itself seemed to inhale, held its breath, and then gently exhale calm. Freyja's lesson was complete. The storm vanished, the frozen motion melted, and the world returned to its normal rhythm, only quieter, profound. When Eiríkr looked up, she was gone, leaving nothing behind but a lingering scent of perfume and a faint scattering of gold dust on the black sand. The physical residue of the goddess who had wept and laughed and finally taught Eiríkr the enduring power of true stillness. Eiríkr was no longer just a keeper of balance. He was a keeper of silence. After that final visitation, when the sea and the goddess had both touched him, Eiríkr aged slowly, as if time itself had grown respectful, unwilling to rush the keeper of silence toward his ending. The cold kiss of Freyja had left its mark, not as a wound but as a benediction. It had slowed the rhythm of his heartbeat to match that of the tides. His hair turned silver long before his back stooped, and even then his strength remained steady, bound to the pulse of the ocean he served. He became a figure both human and mythic, a living boundary between the mortal and divine. When he spoke, people listened not merely to his words, but to the stillness that followed them. His eyes, pale and reflecting both the sea and the sky, carried something vast and unmeasurable. Children whispered that he could speak to whales and that the waves bowed for him, though Eiríkr himself would only smile when they said so. The years brought him veneration. In time, even those who had never known the era of fear came to feel gratitude for the calm they were born into. Children called him the man who made the sea gentle. Fishermen taught their sons that the ocean's peace was not a gift but a covenant, a harmony Eiríkr had forged through humility, sorrow, and listening. This belief had proof in the world itself. When storms rose, when clouds gathered black and heavy over the fjord, the people of Ravensvik did not panic. They had learned that their protector did not need to command the sea. He simply communed with it. On such nights, Eiríkr would walk down to the shore alone, cloak fluttering against the wind, his hair catching the lightning's faint glow. He would sit on a flat stone near the tide, close his eyes, and begin to hum. The sound was low, resonant, and deep enough to be mistaken for the voice of the earth itself. Those close enough to hear described it as a vibration more than a melody, something felt in the bones rather than heard by the ears. He had learned the tone, they said, from the ancient whales that once swam close to Ravensvik's cliffs, those primordial singers of the deep who carried the memory of creation in their calls. When he hummed, the wind changed. It softened, curling around him as though listening. The waves lost their fury. They rolled slower, more deliberate, as if the sea itself recognized the sound of surrender. The storm never vanished entirely, for Eiríkr would not command nature. He would only align with it. But the violence ebbed, replaced by a strange serenity, a peace in the heart of chaos. The villagers watched from their windows or from the safety of the cliffs, and though few dared to speak, they all knew. Their keeper was singing the sea back to itself. He told no one what Freyja had whispered to him during that sacred visitation. The memory of her words remained sealed within him, held like a precious ember that could never be shared without losing its warmth. The lesson of true silence, the silence that listens rather than waits to speak, was his most sacred covenant. But the goddess's message did not fade. It lived through him, through the gentleness in his movements, through the clarity in his gaze, through the way he could comfort grief without words. Sometimes, on quiet mornings when the fog drifted low over the bay, Eiríkr would pause in his steps, look toward the horizon, and smile faintly. He saw her there, in the shimmer of light across the water, in the quiet perfection of dawn. The smile of Freyja, he believed, was not something in the sky. It was in every calm morning, every steady rhythm of the tide. It was her assurance that the balance he guarded was both fragile and eternal. The years did not pass unnoticed for his kin. The sea wolf's transformation left ripples that touched every life in Ravensvik. Ursa, his sister, the woman who had once been cursed to feel nothing, became the village's great healer. Her life had been shaped by sorrow and restored by grace, and so she tended to others with unmatched compassion. She treated wounds, yes, but more often she tended to unseen injuries, the griefs and quiet shames that sickness always concealed. She would say, "No body heals unless the soul exhales first." Her tears, once stolen by the curse, had returned with miraculous power. A single tear from her eye could lower a fever, stop a bleeding wound, or ease a restless child into sleep. When asked how this was possible, Ursa would only say, "Every sorrow returned becomes medicine." She never left Ravensvik. She married, raised children, and grew old under the same sky her brother had loved. But each year, when the sea fog rolled thick over the fjord, she would go down to the shore, kneel where he had once knelt, and whisper, "Brother, the balance holds." And in response, the tide would always draw close enough to kiss her hands. The ring, the weeping jewel, Freyja's gift and curse, was never seen again. It had completed its purpose, carried sorrow back into love, and dissolved into the unseen veins of the earth. Yet, the smiths of Hrafsvik, a slog among them, often claimed that their forges sang on certain nights when no bellows burned. When the flames turned red gold and the iron glowed brighter than usual, they said they could hear a faint humming within the metal itself, as though something ancient and content were breathing there. Sometimes, while mining or near the cliffs of Clawful, they discovered veins of strange metal, red gold with a soft luminescence that shimmered even in darkness. It was unlike any other found in the region. When struck lightly, it vibrated with a delicate tone, like a lullaby sung through stone. A slog, now gray and wise, would run her callous fingers over those veins and whisper, "He still watches. The sea still remembers." To the people of Hrafsvik, those veins were not treasure but testimony, proof that the story of their Jarl and his goddess was not myth, but the geological memory of truth. The mountain itself hummed with it, the faint echo of the weeping jewel. Its sorrow turned into peace and sleep. They named the Eiríkr, meaning metal of mercy. No one traded it. No one forged it into weapons. They used it only for sacred things: harp strings for the skalds, small amulets for newborns, rings for wedding vows. All were made without hammering, shaped gently with heat and patience, for the smiths believed the metal could feel. Eiríkr lived long enough to see the children of his children run barefoot on the shore, unafraid of the sea's power. He would sit by the water, his staff beside him, and watch them play in the surf, their laughter bright and pure. And when the waves grew too strong, they would look to him, and he would smile. The sea always calmed. His wisdom deepened until it no longer belonged solely to him. It became the air of the village, the rhythm of its life. He taught that true strength lay not in resistance, but in surrender, that the greatest courage was not to fight the tide, but to float upon it and trust its return. That sorrow was not punishment but purification, and silence not absence but understanding. "Listen," he would tell them, "for the world speaks in quiet truths. The louder the heart, the less it hears." As age crept upon him, Eiríkr did not diminish. He became simpler, lighter, almost translucent in his peace. Some said his shadow no longer touched the ground. Others claimed they could see the reflection of waves moving across his skin, even when he stood far from shore. He had lived enough to know that every end was a beginning, every tear a prayer, every silence a song waiting to be heard. And when his final season came, he was ready, not for death, but for return. The sea-wolf had done what few mortals ever could. He had listened until even the gods answered. And so he remained, not merely as memory, but as equilibrium itself, the living harmony of sea and soul. In the end, he became what the ocean had always been, vast, enduring, endlessly awake. On the last night of his life, Eiríkr walked alone to the shore. It was a night of transcendent stillness, a night when the veil between worlds felt so thin it might tear with a whisper. The air was cold but not cruel, fragrant with salt and pine resin, the same scent that had clung to him since youth. Above him, the aurora draped itself across the sky, not wild and spiraling as in nights of warning, but calm, tender, deliberate. The ribbons of green and gold shimmered like the hem of Freyja's gown, descending low enough to brush the surface of the sea. It looked, to any who might have seen it, like the goddess herself had come to lay a soft veil over the world, a final curtain of peace. The old keeper felt no fear, no sadness, only gratitude. He had lived long enough to see the balance restored, to see his people laugh without bitterness, to see the sea and the heart reconciled. His hair, once black as raven feathers, was silver now, catching the aurora's glow in threads of light. His steps were slow, not from weakness, but reverence. Each movement seemed a small act of prayer. When he reached the water's edge, he paused. The tide was low, the air silent except for the rhythmic exhale of waves against stone. The sea before him stretched vast and glimmering, neither threatening nor tame. It was his oldest friend, his greatest teacher, and now it would be his final home. He knelt beside the water, his knees sinking into the cold sand. For a long while he said nothing. He simply listened to the wind, to the steady pulse of the tide, to the hum beneath the whirl that only those who had learned silence could hear. Then, in a voice barely louder than breath, he spoke. "If I am to go, let it be where you end." His hand lowered to the surface, palm open, fingers trembling slightly. He did not touch the water in command, but in communion. The moment his skin met the sea, a faint ripple spread outward, circling him in a luminous ring. It was not bright, just enough to suggest that something immense and unseen had answered him. The light lingered for a heartbeat, then dimmed, leaving only the impression of warmth beneath his hand. The sea had heard. The sea had accepted. It was not the great, roaring voice of a goddess, not the thunder divine proclamation. It was something smaller, more intimate, a single ripple curling gently around his wrist, as if the ocean itself reached out to hold him one last time. It felt like the touch of an old friend, a farewell bracelet of water and light. He smiled. "Thank you," he whispered, his words lost in the waves. The exchange was complete. The balance was settled. At dawn the village knew. No messenger came. No voice called out an alarm. The knowing spread the way light spreads through mist, softly, gradually, irresistibly. One by one, people woke with the same wordless awareness pressing upon their hearts. The birds were silent that morning, as though honoring a covenant of quiet. Even the sea seemed subdued, its waves gliding against the shore in slow, measured sighs. When the fishermen went to the beach, they found his cloak folded neatly on the sand, its dark wool still damp with salt. On top of it lay a single, smooth gray stone, a marker, simple and deliberate, chosen by the one who had always sought harmony over grandeur. The stone's surface shimmered faintly in the morning light, as though it held within it the reflection of a vanished aurora. There were no footprints leading away, no sign of struggle, no trace of body. Only the cloak, the stone, and the sea, vast and inscrutable. Eiríkr had not died. He had been received. Ursa, his sister, the healer whose tears had once restored life, was the first approach. Her eyes, pale as glacial ice, filled but did not overflow. She understood better than most that there are tears which must be kept within, to water the soul instead of the earth. She stood at the edge of the tide, her shawl fluttering in the wind, and spoke with the gentle conviction of one repeating a truth she had always known. "He's gone where waves remember names," she said. Her words rippled through the crowd, soft but enduring. The others repeated them under their breath, as if saying them could make them believe that he was not lost, merely transformed. The sea remained calm, its surface brightening under the pale light of dawn. Somewhere deep beneath, perhaps, the keeper's spirit moved through the currents, not as a man, but as memory, carried in the song of whales, in the pulse of tides, in the hush that precedes every storm. Aslauge the smith, his wife, his companion in silence, did not weep. She had spent her life shaping the will of fire and metal. She understood transformation better than anyone. When others faltered, she walked with steady steps to the forge. She placed Eiríkr's ring, a simple band of iron he had worn since youth, on the anvil beside her hammer. Without a word, she lifted the hammer and struck once. The sound rang pure and clear to the morning air, echoing off cliffs and water alike. It was not the sound of mourning. It was a vow fulfilled, a sound that said, "The work is done, the promise stands." The villagers froze, listening. The note hung impossibly long before fading into silence. When it vanished, it left behind a strange, beautiful calm, like the breath after prayer. "Did you hear it?" a child whispered. "Yes," an elder replied. "He said goodbye." Aslauge placed the hammer down and rested her hand upon the cooling metal. "No," she murmured. He said continue. And so they did. In the days that followed, the air in Hrafnsvik seemed changed. The sea mist glowed faintly at dawn, as if lit from within. The tide were gentler. The gulls flew lower, and at night, the aurora returned, not as a storm, but as a flowing bridge of gold across the northern sky. The vulva declared a sign that the keeper had reached his destination. "He walks between worlds now," she said, "where light and tide meet. He keeps the silence beyond silence." Children born that year were said to carry a strange calm in their eyes, as though they had been blessed in their mother's wombs by the spirit of the sea wolf. Some could sense storms before they formed. Others could calm the cries of animals. And when they laughed, the sea seemed to echo faintly as if amused. The people of Hrafnsvik built no tomb for Eiríkr. He had forbidden it long ago. Instead, they carved a small circle of runes into the largest stone at the harbor's edge. The inscription was simple, written in old runic lines that shimmered with the salt of the sea spray. "Balance is not an ending, but the breath between." Every year, on the anniversary of his passing, they gathered at dusk by that stone. They brought offerings of water and flame, one for Freyja, one for Eiríkr. The ceremony was wordless. They listened to the sea, and the sea always answered, sometimes with a single, larger wave that touched their feet, sometimes with the cry of a gull that sounded almost like a human sigh. It was enough. In the centuries that followed, the story of that night spread far beyond the fjord. The skalds who sang of Eiríkr's life called his death the quiet return. They told of how the aurora bent low to meet him, how the sea folded him into its heart, and how silence itself wept with gratitude. Sailors spoke his name before casting nets, lovers before parting, warriors before battle. And when storms raged and ships found themselves on the edge of destruction, some claimed they saw a figure walking upon the waves, a tall man in a dark cloak, his hair glinting like moonlit silver. He never spoke. He only raised a hand, and the sea calmed. No one in Hrafnsvik doubted these tales. They knew their keeper had not vanished. He had simply dissolved into what he loved most, the eternal rhythm of the world's breath. And in that rhythm, the people learned the final truth of the sea wolf's journey, that the heart that breaks and lives again does not end in silence. It becomes silence, a silence vast enough to hold every sound, every sorrow, every joy. And so Eiríkr's peace endured, not as memory, but as music, resonating forever in the sounds and stillness of Hrafnsvik. Seasons passed into stories in Hrafnsvik. The rhythm of time was no longer measured by moons or harvests, but by tales, each one a vessel carrying a drop of remembrance through the ages. The sea shifted, the mountains endured, and the people moved in harmony between them, guided by a wisdom that no longer needed to be taught. It had become instinct. Eiríkr's life was no longer merely a story told by firelight. It had passed beyond history and become a fundamental myth, a sacred current woven through the village's pulse. His name was not spoken with the distance reserved for heroes of the past, but with the intimacy one uses for family. To the people of Hrafnsvik, he was not a man who had been. He was a presence that was. Every dawn, when fishermen pushed their boats in the sand, they bowed briefly toward the horizon, murmuring, "Keep us steady, O wolf." Every evening, when they returned, they poured a drop of seawater over the prow before stepping ashore. It was not superstition. It was conversation. In their hearts, they believed the sea still listened, and through it, Eiríkr still replied. The children of Hrafnsvik continued the tradition their Jarl had embodied centuries before. Before every meal, before every celebration or departure, they would pour a drop of clean water onto the earth or the hearthstone, whispering words too soft to be heard, but always understood. A thank you to the sea wolf who had taught them balance. The act was small, simple, but profound. It carried within it the oldest truth of their people, the knowledge that sorrow and joy, strength and gentleness, were not opposites but two halves of one eternal whole. The mothers taught this ritual with tenderness. A heart that only knows happiness grows weak, they told their little ones, and a heart that knows only pain forgets to breathe. But a heart that knows both becomes as vast as the sea. In this way, balance became not doctrine, but daily life. Eiríkr's legend spread far beyond the fjord. Skalds and poets from distant halls carried his name across kingdoms. They came to Hrafnsvik in longships, drawn not by conquest but by curiosity. They listened to the wind sighing to the pines and to the waves echoing against the rocks, and when they returned home, they sang of what they had heard. Their verses carried the unmistakable scent of salt and resin, of smoke and silence. They spoke of a man who had not sought glory, yet became immortal, of a warrior who laid down his weapon to lift his people, of a keeper's silence whose greatest triumph was empathy. His story was loved not because he had slain a beast or ruled a land, but because he had conquered something far more treacherous, the emptiness within the human heart. Through him, the North remembered how to feel again. In distant kingdoms, children learned his name as a prayer. Lovers whispered it in moments of doubt. Sailors carved it into their hulls before voyages. And in every echo of his story, the sea's voice lingered, a quiet reminder that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to love in its presence. The Volva of Hrafnsvik, once a young apprentice, now ancient as the cliffs, became the living vessel of these mysteries. Her hair had turned the color of sea foam. Her eyes shimmered with the same soft gold that once burned within Freyja's ring. Her presence was both comfort and command. When she spoke, the wind seemed to pause out of respect. She was the last keeper of the old magic, the bridge between the mortal and the divine, between story and truth. And she said that beneath the land, beneath even the bones of the mountain, the red gold ring still turned. Slowly, ceaselessly, like the heartbeat of a sleeping goddess, it rotated within the hidden veins of the earth. It moves with us, she said. When we mourn, it slows. When we forgive, it brightens. When we love, it turns. To her, the ring was no longer a relic of sorrow, but the metronome of Hrafnsvik's soul, the pulse that kept all hearts in tune. When gentle rain fell upon the village, the people smiled and looked toward the sea. They no longer feared storms or floods. They had learned to recognize the subtle moods of the weather as emotions of the world itself. The Volva would lift her face to the drizzle and murmur, "He's visiting." The rain, she said, was Eiríkr's tears, an expression of his quiet, eternal empathy. And always, after such rain, the air smelled of iron and pine, as if the sea wolf himself had walked once more along the shore. Children danced in puddles that mirrored the sky, laughing without fear. Fishermen let the rain soak their shoulders, whispering blessings into wind. And the old woman, seated by her window, watched them with a serene smile. "He has not left us," she would say. "He never will. Balance has no end." The fear of the ocean, once the village's greatest curse, was gone. Long ago, it had been seen as a devourer, a grave of men and memory. Now it was kin. The people spoke to it as one speaks to an elder, respectful, honest, and unafraid. When they launched their boats, they greeted the water with laughter. When they lost someone to the waves, they did not curse. They sang. They had learned what Eiríkr had known, that the sea and the heart were reflections of each other. Both could rage and destroy. Both could cradle and heal. Both demanded reverence, but neither demanded fear. Even the youngest child understood the sacred kinship. They were taught from their first steps that the ocean, like love, could not be owned or conquered. It could only be met with humility. At the center of the village stood a great circle of stones known as the Listening Ring. No one remembered who had built it. Some said Eiríkr had placed them himself. Others claimed the sea had arranged them in gratitude. In the evenings, when the wind carried the scent of brine, the villagers gathered there to share stories, sing old songs, and leave offerings of salt water and flowers. When the moon rose, its light filled the hollow between the stones, creating a faint golden shimmer, an echo, perhaps, of Freyja's ring deep below. It was in that place that the people celebrated the Night of Balance each year. Torches ringed the cliffs, and their reflections danced across the dark water. There were no speeches, no prayers, only silence, a silence filled with listening. Children were taught that silence was not emptiness but invitation. It was a moment in which the sea might choose to speak. And sometimes it did. Those who lingered longest claimed they could hear faint humming in the air, a sound like distant waves blending with the rhythm of a heartbeat. The Volva said it was the sea remembering its promise, the echo of Eiríkr's song still pulsing beneath the world. As decades turned into centuries, the story of the sea wolf wove itself into the fabric of every life. His likeness appeared carved into doorframes and woven into sails. His name was invoked in weddings and births, in the first cry of a newborn and the final breath of the dying. He was no longer merely a man of legend. He was the breath between heartbeats, the pause between storms. Even as the world beyond Hrafnsvik changed, Empires rising and falling, tongues twisting into new shapes. The spirit of the sea wolf remained unchanged. It did not belong to time. It belonged to the cycle itself. And so the people of Hrafnsvik lived not in fear of change, but in partnership with it. They built, they lost, they wept, they rejoiced, all under the same sky, all beside the same sea that had once taught their Jarl to listen. The waves sang endlessly against the shore, their song neither loud nor mournful. It was a melody of balance, of beginnings and endings braided together. And within that song, if one listened closely, one could still hear the faintest whisper, the soft echo of a man's voice, calm and steady, murmuring to the water he had loved. Be kind, even when you are vast. The ocean, as ever, obeyed. And thus Eiríkr, the keeper of silence, continued to hold his people, not through command or fear, but through the rhythm of their hearts and the song of their sea. In every drop of water poured before a meal, in every word spoken with empathy, in every breath of wind to the fjord, his legacy lived on. He had secured their place, not as masters of nature, but as part of its endless, mutable harmony. The mutable song of Hrafnsvik played on, soft, eternal, and beautifully unfinished. In time, the boundaries between history and myth became irretrievably blurred in Hrafnsvik. The tale of Eiríkr, the sea wolf who became the keeper of balance, grew with each generation, becoming more than a chronicle. It transformed into a foundational fabric of their identity. No one any longer remembered which parts of the tale were real, and which were merely the reverberations of an imagination of a people who had found peace. The truth, often cold and stark, was skillfully adorned with the comforting sheen of legend, the myths and the quiet truth. The versions of his departure were as varied as the northern stars. Some villagers, particularly the mountain hunters, said Eiríkr became a white wolf running over ice. They argued that his wild nature, his affinity for the cold, and his silent step had transfigured him into a creature of earth and snow, a guardian who watched over their lands from above. This legend comforted the landfolk, those who saw their fate tied to the mountain's stability. Others, the fishers and sailors who entrusted their lives to the water, swore he lived still, but beneath the fjord, keeping storms at bay. For them, Eiríkr had achieved immortality in the water he loved so well. His unseen presence was the reason their nets were always full, and why the sea was now a cautious kin, not a bloodthirsty foe. It was their way of naming the ocean's newfound calm. Yet the truth was quieter. It resided in the observation, in the feeling passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, in the hearts of the Hrafnsvik people. Eiríkr's absence was not the end of a story, but the beginning of an eternal ritual, memory practicing endurance. On nights of profound silence, when the northern light shimmered, the subtle reality of his legacy manifested. When the aurora flickered red, the color of the cursed gold in the heart that broke in order to live, the fishermen casting their lines at night would have the experience. They would hear firm, rhythmic footsteps pacing the shallows. It was not the clumsy sound of the living, but the correct sound of someone perfectly in harmony with the rocky ground, moving exactly where the salt met the sand. And amidst the murmur of the tide, they would hear a man's voice humming softly, half prayer, half song. It was a simple melody of a father comforting his child, or a guardian reassuring his post. The villagers knew it was not a ghost. Ghosts cause fear and imbalance. This sound brought peace and the certainty that order was maintained. It was memory practicing endurance. The recollection of Eiríkr's sacrifice, his sorrow, his wisdom, was so deeply bound to the sea that it became part of the ocean's own function. The sea was rehearsing how to keep a friend alive. The sea, which had once sung of a promise it didn't know whether to keep, had found its purpose in Eiríkr's legacy. The blue vastness did not forget him. Instead, it became his memory, whispering his name and his step to maintain the balance he had established. Eiríkr, the sea wolf, had not vanished. He had become the lasting calm of Hrafnsvik. He was the eternal echo of the promise that though hearts may break, they can and must live beautifully. One child, named Sigrid, grew up listening to the stories of Eiríkr, the sea wolf, the man who had taught the ocean to listen and, in turn, learned its sorrow. Her cradle songs were not lullabies of kings or battles, but the rhythmic hush of the tide brushing against the rocks below her window. The people of Hrafnsvik whispered that she had been born during a night when the sea stood eerily still, as if holding its breath to hear the first cry of the newborn who would one day speak to it again. Sigrid had the kind of curiosity that frightened mothers and fascinated old storytellers. She would wander the shore even when the fog rolled in thick as wool, tracing patterns in the sand that no one else understood. She collected bits of shell that seemed to hum faintly when she pressed them to her ear, and sometimes when the dusk deepened to blue and the first star trembled awake above the fjord, she would swear she could hear a soft humming beneath the surface of the water, a tune older than memory, a melody made of breath and tide. "Don't go near the shore after dark," her grandmother warned her one evening. "That's when the old songs wake up. Some are kind, some are hungry." But Sigrid was a child of balance, born to a world already healed. Fear had no root in her heart. To her, the unknown was not danger, it was invitation. One night, drawn by that faint, comforting melody that always seemed to call her name, Sigrid slipped out her home and followed the sound down the worn stone path that led to the edge of the tide. The moon was high, its light spilling over the sea like liquid silver. The air was still except for the rhythmic breathing of the waves. She stepped carefully, the cold mist dampening her hair, the sand cool beneath her bare feet. She saw nothing unusual, only foam and moonlight, the ordinary beauty of a Hrafnsvik night. Yet she stood silently listening. The humming was clearer now, deep, slow, and tender, as though the ocean itself were singing to a sleeping child. It wasn't a song of sorrow or warning. It was gratitude, a memory turned gentle. For a long time, Sigrid said nothing. She just breathed with the sea, matching her small lungs to its vast rhythm. And then, without thinking, she whispered, "I hear you." At that moment, the world seemed to pause. The wind softened, the waves stilled just enough for their reflection to hold steady. Trusting the harmony she felt, Sigrid crouched beside the water and reached out her hand. The moment her fingers broke the surface, the sea responded, not violently, not with force, but with light. It began as a faint shimmer, no brighter than the reflection of the moon. Then, softly, it grew, a ring of luminescence spreading outward from her hand, circling once, twice, before folding upon itself like a sigh. The glow was neither warm nor cold. It was an ancient memory waking up for just a moment to greet her. The light traced a perfect circle beneath the surface, almost perfect but not quite closed. There remained a thin, deliberate gap, a breath between beginning and end. It was the shape of a ring, yes, but also the shape of what was still come. Within that incomplete circle lived all that the sea wolf had given and all that Freyja had wept for, the memory of the jewel, the sorrow of divine love, the final surrender that healed a world. It pulsed once, faintly, like a fading heartbeat. Then the light drew inward and vanished, dissolving back into the dark water, as though it had never been. Sigrid stayed kneeling long after the glow had gone. She did not cry or call out. She simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that carried the quiet certainty of purpose. She had seen enough to understand, even if she could not yet name what she had seen. "I'll finish it someday," she whispered, her voice trembling not from fear but from awe. It was a vow made without witness, save the sea itself. Yet in Hrafnsvik, that was enough. The ocean heard every promise. The waves rolled closer, brushing her knees in a gesture that felt like acknowledgement. A single wave broke against the stones, releasing a soft, sibilant murmur that almost sounded like laughter. "We'll be here," the sea replied. Sigrid laughed softly in return, and in that shared moment, something ancient was renewed. A conversation once severed had begun again. Above her, the stars shimmered brighter. They seemed to listen, too, slowly. Their scattered brilliance gathered into form, a vast spiral constellation blooming across the night sky. It wound outward and inward at once, endless and self-returning, echoing the very pulse of the tide. Those who saw it from the village below said it looked like the eye of the sea gazing down in wonder. Others said it was a goddess herself smiling upon her new keeper. Sigrid watched the stars for a long time. The spiral turned faintly, not fixed like other constellations, but alive, shifting, breathing. In its motion she saw the truth of everything Eiríkr had taught, that no balance is ever complete, that peace itself must keep moving or it will drown. The circle must always remain slightly open, allowing life to flow through it. When she finally rose, her hand still tingled faintly from the touch of the sea. She glanced once more at the horizon, where the dark water met the lighter sky. The line between them seemed to shimmer, as though whispering secrets to those who dared to look long enough. As she walked back toward the village, she felt the world around her lean in, listening. The gulls were silent. The wind had quieted. Even the surf softened, as if careful not to disturb her thoughts. She did not yet know what it meant to be a keeper, but she sensed that the time for listening had begun anew. In the days that followed, Sigurd returned often to that spot. Sometimes she would sing softly, her voice mingling with the water's hum. Sometimes she would bring small offerings, pebbles shaped like hearts, bits of polished glass, feathers from seabirds that had drifted too close to shore. Each time, the sea accepted them with a gentle lap of foam. Each time, Sigurd left feeling lighter, as though she had spoken with someone who understood her completely. The villagers began to notice small changes. The fish returned earlier each season, as though guided by invisible currents. Storms that once lashed the coast now broke apart harmlessly before reaching the bay. The children said they saw lights dancing beneath the water on still nights, like constellations reflected from below rather than above. The elders nodded knowingly. "It listens again," they said. "The sea remembers its friend." As Sigrid grew, so did her bond with the ocean. She learned its moods, its subtle language of foam and tide. She could predict storms by scent alone. And when she sang at the harbor, even the roughest sailors felt their hearts steady. The people began calling her the Listener, a title once given to Eiríkr, and she wore it not with pride, but with grace. She did not seek power or reverence. She sought only to continue the conversation. Years later, when she was older and the moonlight had painted silver in her hair, she stood again at the same spot where her childhood vow had been made. The sea before her was calm, yet beneath the surface she could feel its infinite motion, the same eternal breath, unchanged. She raised her hand once more, and the waves rose slightly, as if to meet it. "I remember," she said, and in answer, the sea shimmered faintly, outlining that same incomplete circle beneath her reflection. But this time, just for an instant, the line closed. The ring of light sealed, pulsed, and then opened again, a perfect rhythm of completion and release. It was a final lesson. The promise that nothing is ever truly finished, that endings are only pauses in the great cycle of becoming. Sigrid smiled, tears glinting like stars in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. The sea breathed back, a low murmur that could have been the word always. That night, as the villagers slept, the spiral of stars overhead brightened, spinning slowly across the heavens. It was said that for one night, all of Midgard felt the ocean's peace. Travelers in faraway lands dreamed of gentle tides and woke with salt on their lips. The old, the grieving, the lost, all felt for a heartbeat that they belonged once more to something vast and kind. From that night onward, whenever the moon was full and the wind was still, children of Hrafsvik would gather on the shore and dip their fingers into the water, hoping to glimpse that quiet glow. And sometimes, if they were pure of heart and patient of soul, the sea would answer them too, tracing a soft, incomplete circle beneath their touch, a reminder that they, too, were part of the endless story. The saga of Hrafnsvik, the sea, and the sorrowful gold continued, not as a tragedy nor even as a legend, but as a living vow renewed with every generation. It would be written not in books or carved in stone, but carried in hearts that dared to listen to the silence between the waves. And somewhere deep beneath the surface, in the vast stillness where light fades into dream, a familiar voice hummed a timeless refrain. Before the sea learned patience, it loved a child who could listen, and the sea, content, listened back. Generations came and went, folding their fragile stories into continuous, peaceful history of Hrafsvik. The years passed like tides, each one returning changed, each leaving behind traces of salt, laughter, and prayer. The village grew, yes, but never beyond its soul. It built new docks, new roofs, new hearths, but it never forgot the rhythm that had been written into its very breath. The careful balance established by Eiríkr, the keeper of the sea's heart. Even when the world outside turned faster, when iron ships replaced wooden ones and distant kingdoms rose and fell, Hrafnsvik remained steady. Its people moved with the tempo of the waves, neither rushing nor resisting the flow of life. They fished as their ancestors had fished. They celebrated the solstices with the same humble bonfires. And when storms came, they did not curse the wind. They listened to it, as Eiríkr had done, hearing within the thunder the whisper of divine remembrance. The lessons of the sea wolf, once learned through tragedy, had long become the marrow of their existence. When grief came, the villagers no longer tried to shut their doors against it. They let it enter, sat with it by the fire, and poured it a cup of tea. They understood that sorrow was not punishment but passage, that to weep was to cleanse the spirit, to let the sea of one's heart renew itself. Mothers taught their children to cry without shame, for tears, they said, were sacred waters that returned to the ocean of all souls. And when joy arrived, they shared it openly, knowing that happiness, too, must circulate like tide water to remain pure. When fish were plentiful, none went hungry. When the harvest was good, the elders feasted first, and the children danced under lanterns strung across the docks. The laughter that echoed through the harbor was said to reach even the depths of the sea, where old spirits smiled in the dark. The smiths, descendants of a Slog the Tempered, continued their sacred craft. Their forges glowed like miniature suns during the long winters, the clang of hammers ringing out as a heartbeat of continuity. Every blade they made, every tool, every trinket was baptized in seawater before being given to its owner. To remember the source, the smiths would say, dipping the glowing metal into the brine with reverence, "The sea tempers everything, even us." Some whispered that the seawater itself held trace echoes of the old magic, that beneath its surface still shimmered the light of Freyja's ring, long buried, yet awake. The smiths did not deny it. When the quenching steam rose in silver coils, they said it was the sea exhaling its blessings, a reminder that every creation came from union, of fire and water, of grief and grace. The storytellers of Hrafnsvik, keepers of memory and heart, carried forward Bjarni Quickhand's legacy. They were the new shamans of voice and rhythm, weaving the past into the present with words as fine as sea silk. Around every hearth, in taverns and halls, the stories began the same way. The people waited for that single, sacred line that anchored the world. Before the sea learned patience, it loved a man who could listen. The sentence was like a key that unlocked an invisible door. It opened hearts, silenced rooms, and reminded all who heard it that even the wildest forces could be softened by understanding. Children would hush their laughter. Elders would bow their heads. That first line carried everything. The wild hunger of the waves, the deep tenderness between the sea and the mortal who had once dared to speak with it, and the ultimate wisdom born from silence. Each retelling changed slightly, like waves reshaping the same shore. In some versions, Eiríkr was a mortal who found divinity through humility. In others, he had become one with the sea, forever guiding lost sailors to safety. And in still others, he had dissolved entirely, his soul scattered among the winds, speaking softly through the ocean spray that kissed the cliffs each morning. But in every telling, the heart of the story remained unbroken. The balance between sorrow and serenity, between holding on and letting go. Travelers who passed through Hrafnsvik, merchants, scholars, wanderers, always left changed. They arrived curious, perhaps skeptical of the village's quiet ways, but they departed subdued, eyes glistening, hearts oddly lighter. Many could not explain why they wept when they heard the tale of Eiríkr and the sea wolf. They felt as though something long dormant within them had been touched, an ancient ache, a longing both personal and universal. The villagers said it was a song remembering itself. The sorrow and redemption of Hrafnsvik had become woven into the collective fabric of humankind, a story that did not belong to one people or one time, but to the ocean within every soul. When those travelers wept, the wind carried their tears out to sea, and the waves, patient, eternal, kind, gathered each one with care, cradling them as pearls in their vast hands. It was said that when moonlight struck the water just right, you could see the ocean sparkle with countless lights. Not stars reflected, but tears remembered, each one a moment of empathy returned to the source. Thus the great cycle continued, complete and unbroken. The tears that had once been stolen by greed and pride had been restored, transmuted into compassion. The sea, once vengeful, had become a mirror of mercy. And now, whenever hearts anywhere in the world softened enough to feel another's pain, the ocean felt it too. Each act of kindness sent ripples that reached the fjords of Hrafsvik, where they merged with the tide like familiar voices coming home. As centuries folded over the land, the world changed around them. The stars themselves shifted in their courses. New empires rose across distant continents. Languages evolved and disappeared. But in Hrafnsvik, the essence endured. The people still built their homes near the water, still left small offerings of flowers or bread on the rocks during midsummer, still paused in reverent silence when the gulls circled low at dusk. It was not superstition. It was gratitude. And in that gratitude, the village found immortality. Even the children, born into an age of strange machines and foreign music, grew up knowing the heartbeat of the waves. They learned that silence could speak, that patience could heal, and that the smallest act of compassion could balance the mightiest storm. Their toys were made of driftwood, their dreams filled with the sea's voice whispering, "Remember what was given and give it again." The elders often said that the sea itself had memory, not of events, but of emotions. It remembered every tear shed in love, every laughter shared in forgiveness. And so long as one person in Hrafsvik listened, the story would continue, not in words carved on stone, but in the living rhythm of breath, tide, and heart. At night, when the wind howled through the fjords, it no longer sounded like mourning. It sounded like a lullaby. The people slept to its music, trusting that whatever storms might come, the balance would always return. Sometimes, under the long northern twilight, the aurora spilled across the sky, casting green and gold veils upon the sea. The villagers would gather on the cliffs to watch, believing that those lights were the souls of the past dancing in the heavens. They said Eiríkr was among them still, walking upon the water as dawn approached, listening as he always had, listening to the world breathe. And beneath it all, the sea kept its quiet promise. Every tear given in sorrow returned as light. Every sorrow returned as song. Every song became a prayer. And every prayer, eventually, found its way home. The circle held. The rhythm endured. And the name of Hrafnsvik was never lost, for it was no longer a place alone. It was a state of being. Thus ended the final verse of Sea Wolf Saga. Not with thunder or prophecy, but with peace, vast and shimmering as the northern waters themselves. The tale that began with loss ended in harmony, and the sea, infinite and awake, whispered its eternal refrain. All that we surrender in love, we receive again as light. And so the saga endured, the great tale of the sea wolf and the weeping jewel, not carved on stone, a fragile marker history, but sung in breath and tide, woven into the very fabric of life in Hrafsvik. It was not merely remembered. It was lived in every rising mist, in every gull's cry, in every hush that followed a storm. The villagers no longer feared the sea as they once did, for they had learned that its voice carried not only wrath, but wisdom. The harbor, once haunted by grief, became a place of reverence. Fishermen tied charms of driftwood and iron to their masts, not to ward off evil, but to honor the balance between what was taken and what was given. The children, growing under skies that remembered everything, learned the story before they learned to write. How love had been broken and mended, how pride had been swallowed by the tide, and how forgiveness had been found at the bottom of the sea. Freyja's ring, the weeping jewel, the catalyst of sorrow and redemption, remained buried beneath shifting sand. Yet it was not lost. Its glow persisted under the waves, faint but constant, like the pulse of the earth itself. It had ceased to seek attention. It simply was. The magic within it was awake, patient, waiting for hands capable of the same profound empathy Eiríkr had achieved. Not hands of greed or conquest, but of humility, hands that could hold power without being possessed by it. The ring waited for a heart able to wear sorrow, without turning it into pride. Above, the world turned, and seasons folded over Hrafsvik like pages in an endless book. Winters were less cruel now. The wind that swept the fjords no longer carried the bitterness of vengeance, but the soft cry of remembrance. When snow fell, it blanketed the graves by the shore, where those who had perished in the great storm now rested in peace. Their names were whispered by the waves, their deeds sung by fishermen who believed that the sea itself had become their voice. The old seer, Ylva, lived long enough to see 3 generations born under gentler skies. Her hair turned the color of sea foam, and her eyes, once sharp as ravens' wings, grew milky and distant like the horizon in fog. Yet when she spoke, her words still carried the same ancient gravity. "Listen well," she would tell the children, her hand trembling slightly as she traced circles in the sand. "The sea does not forget, but it forgives. It will always forgive if you listen." And they did. The people of Hrafnsvik learned to listen. To the sigh of the wind through the cliffs, to the groan of the ice breaking in spring, to the lull of the tide at dusk. They distinguished warning from welcome, chaos from calm. They knew that silence, too, was a kind of message. Every dawn broke like a memory kept, a soft renewal that honored lessons born of darkness. Eirikr's name became legend, but not in the manner of kings or conquerors. His story was not one of triumph, but of return. He had not slain monsters or commanded gods. He had simply faced himself and chosen compassion over pride. In that choice, he became immortal not in body, but in meaning. His descendants carried the quiet strength of his humility, and through them, his spirit remained a tide that never receded. Sometimes, at low tide, villagers claimed to see a faint shimmer beneath the waves where the sand glowed as though remembering light. Children would kneel by the shore, hoping to glimpse the ring that had once cursed and blessed their people. But it never surfaced. It stayed below, a secret kept between sea and goddess. Beneath those waves, deep within the vast and silent chambers of the ocean's memory, a voice still murmured, a low, eternal hum that seemed to pulse through the water itself. The gold that is given back always returns as light. It was a distilled truth of Freyja, the goddess's final whisper, a reversal of the oldest law tribute, proclaiming that no offering made in love is ever lost. Every act of surrender, every moment of empathy, ripples outward until it becomes illumination. That truth reached the hearts of mortals and gods alike. Even the Aesir, from their distant halls, felt a tremor of understanding pass through the fabric of the realms. Balance had been restored, not by war, but by grief embraced and transmuted. The world at last understood, and when it did, something subtle shifted across all creation. The trees of Midgard seemed to breathe more deeply. The glaciers sighed with ancient relief. The wind moved through the valleys not as an intruder, but as a guest. Even the stars above Hrafnsvik seemed to burn with more patient light, as though they too had learned the virtue of waiting. In the long years that followed, the tale of the sea wolf and the weeping jewel was sung by bards who never knew its full truth. Some said Eiríkr had become a spirit of the sea, guiding lost sailors home. Others claimed the ring still pulsed when storms approached, warning those who listened. But the oldest songs, the ones whispered by firelight on winter nights, spoke of something deeper, that every soul must someday face its own tide and in surrender find salvation. As centuries passed, the village itself transformed. Stone paths replaced mud. Lanterns lit the harbor each evening, their reflections trembling like souls on the water. The temple that once stood in ruin was rebuilt, not as a monument to power, but as a sanctuary for balance. Inside it hung no idols, only a single empty circle carved of driftwood, symbolizing the ring that was both burden and blessing. Pilgrims came from far shores to see it, to touch the smooth grain polished by countless hands, and to whisper prayers not for fortune but for understanding. Sometimes, when the moon hung low and the tide receded far enough, the villagers claimed they could hear singing from beneath the surface, a chorus of voices soft as foam. No one could tell if it was wind, current, or memory, but those who listened closely swore that the song spoke of peace and of love unbroken by time. The goddess Freyja watched silently from her unseen realm, her tears now spent. In their place was a quiet smile, the kind worn by one who has witnessed both the breaking and the mending of hearts. She no longer sent omens or storms. Her lessons had been learned. The humans of Hrafnsvik had become their own priests, their own keepers of balance. And in that, the goddess found her rest. At the edge of the known world, where mountains kiss the sea and the northern lights drew shimmering bridges between heaven and earth, the song of Hrafnsvik continued. It wove through every life, every generation, an invisible thread of empathy binding all beings to one another. It was said that those who walked the shore at dawn could still feel Eiríkr's presence in the mist, calm, vast, unjudging. Some left offerings of flowers or shells. Others simply stood in silence, letting the salt air wash through them like prayer, for the sea still spoke, and the people still listened. When storms rose, they did not curse the waves. They thanked them for reminding all life of its fragile rhythm. When ships were lost, they mourned without despair, knowing that no soul truly vanished into deep, that each drop returned the ocean a being, shining once more as light upon another shore. So the saga endured no longer a tragedy, but a hymn. It was told in laughter shared after hardship, in hands extended to help, in the quiet dignity of forgiveness. And as the last light of day slipped into horizon, the sea glimmered like liquid gold, reflecting a truth older than gods and men alike, that every sorrow, when returned in love, becomes its own redemption. The cycle was complete, the balance secured, and the mutable song of Hrafnsvik continued, harmonious, eternal, infinite as breath itself.